There are artifacts in the Imperium older than human memory, older than Terra's oldest mountains, older than the species itself. Some were buried for a reason. Some were buried by things that understood what mercy truly meant. On the forge world of Arcturus Prime, nobody remembered that lesson. The Mechanicus excavation had been underway for 17 months. Deep beneath the planet's crust, past layers of compressed stone that predated the Age of Strife, the tech priests had detected energy signatures that made their cogitators sing hymns of discovery. Archaeotech, pure, untouched, impossibly ancient, the kind of find that earned Forge World designations and millennia of prestige. Magos Dominus Talric-7 stood at the edge of the dig site, his augmented eyes cycling through 17 different spectra as he observed the final meters of excavation. Servo skulls drifted through the massive underground cavern, their auspex arrays painting the darkness with scanning lasers. 300 tech priests and servitors worked in perfect synchronization, their movements orchestrated by noospheric data streams that flowed through Talric's consciousness like a second nervous system. The chamber was wrong. Every analysis confirmed it. The walls weren't carved. They were grown. Crystalline structures that seemed to fold space around themselves in geometrically impossible ways. The atmosphere tasted of ozone and something else, something his olfactory sensors couldn't categorize. Ancient didn't begin to describe this place. This was elder in a way that made the Imperium seem like an infant crying in the dark. "Mergos," said Tech Priest Yarvex, his vox grill crackling with barely contained excitement. "Final layer breach in 30 seconds. The energy readings are unprecedented. The machine spirits are singing, Dominus. They're singing." Talric-7 had served the Omniscii for 243 years. He had excavated archaeotech sites across 3 sectors. He had witnessed the activation of STC fragments that made grown tech priests weep sacred oil. But he had never heard a machine spirit sing. Machine spirits calculated, they processed, they didn't sing. Warning subroutines flickered through his consciousness, but he dismissed them. Fear was the mind killer, the corruption of pure logic. The Omniscii rewarded those who sought knowledge in the darkness. If you hunger for more tales from humanity's desperate struggle in the 41st millennium, hit that subscribe button. The Omniscii blesses those who preserve sacred knowledge, and this channel is a vault of dark truths the Imperium would rather you forgot. The drill servitors broke through. The sound was wrong, not the expected crash of metal through stone, but a crystalline chime that seemed to resonate in frequencies human ears weren't designed to perceive. Talric felt it in his chest, in his remaining organic components, a vibration that made his blood remember something his mind had never known. The chamber beyond was small, 12 meters across, perfectly spherical, walls of black material that seemed to drink light, and in the center, suspended in mathematical impossibility, floated a pyramid. No, not floated, existed. The pyramid didn't occupy space, it defined space. Reality bent around it like water around a stone, except the stone was the size of a man's torso, and reality was the water. "Magnificent," Talric breathed, his vocal synthesizer barely functioning. "Begin documentation protocols, full spectral analysis. I want every cogitator we have dedicated to..." The pyramid pulsed. Light, not light from the pyramid, but light leaving the pyramid, as if it were drinking the photons from their lumen globes, from their auspex beams, from the bioluminescence of the fungal growth on the cavern walls. Darkness spread like spilled ink. Magos, Yarvex's voice carried an edge Talric had never heard before. Fear, raw, unprocessed human fear bleeding through 2 centuries of augmentation. The machine spirits, they've stopped singing, Dominus. They're screaming. Talric's cogitators registered the data. Temperature drop, 47 degrees in 2.3 seconds. Atmospheric pressure fluctuation, impossible. Gravitational constant, variable. Variable. The laws of physics were suggestions in this chamber. The pyramid pulsed again. This time Talric saw it, saw through it. For a fraction of a second, his enhanced perception caught something behind the geometric prison, an entity that his mind refused to process, an entity that existed in angles his consciousness couldn't categorize, something that had been compressed, folded, imprisoned in a cage of living metal and screaming mathematics, something that was waking up. "Seal the chamber," Talric commanded, his vox grill steady even as his organic heart hammered against his augmented ribcage. "Emergency protocols. Nobody enters until—" The nearest servo skull simply ceased to exist. No explosion, no malfunction. One moment it was scanning the pyramid. The next moment there was a perfectly spherical void where it had been, edges so clean they looked surgical. Then Tech Priest Yarvex started screaming. His augmented vocal cords produced sounds that shouldn't have been anatomically possible, frequencies that made the other Tech Priests clutch their heads, organic and mechanical components both rejecting the input. Talric turned and saw Yarvex's body unmaking itself. Not burning, not dissolving, unmaking. His flesh didn't rot or decay. It simply stopped having ever existed, layer by layer, atom by atom, while he remained conscious enough to scream. The pyramid pulsed a third time, and deep in the darkness of its geometric prison, something that had devoured stars opened eyes that remembered when the galaxy was young. The Mechanicus had protocols for everything. Xenos incursion, Protocol Xenophone Alpha. Chaos manifestation, Protocol Martyrdom Sigma. Archaeological anomaly, Protocol Archeo Tertius. But there was no protocol for watching your reality unravel one atom at a time. Talric-7's combat subroutines activated automatically. His integrated weapons systems, a plasmacaster in his right arm, a graviton projector in his left, hummed to life. 243 years of experience told him to fight. Every instinct screamed to defend the excavation, to protect the knowledge they'd uncovered. His survival algorithms told him to run. He ran. "All personnel, immediate evacuation. Seal bulkheads primus through Quartus. This is not a drill." His Vox transmission cut through the panicked screaming, but panic was already spreading like a virus through the newospheric network. Tech priests were feeling things they'd spent centuries purging from their consciousnesses, raw primal terror that bypassed every augmentation and spoke directly to the animal brainstem that remembered when humanity was prey. Behind him, the pyramid was no longer pulsing, it was breathing. Each exhalation consumed more of the cavern. Stone that had existed for eons simply wasn't anymore. The void spread in perfect geometric patterns, fractals of non-existence that looked almost beautiful if you didn't understand what you were seeing. Yarvex's screaming had stopped. There wasn't enough of him left to scream. Talric reached the primary access tunnel and slammed his mechanodendrite against the emergency seal. Plasteel doors 3 meters thick ground shut with a pneumatic hiss that sounded pathetically inadequate. Behind the sealing doors, 17 tech priests and 43 servitors remained in the chamber. The noospheric network showed their life signs winking out one by one, not dying, but simply ceasing, as if the universe was editing them out of existence. "Dominus!" Techabept Vralik stumbled up the tunnel, her robe smoking, her facial augments sparking and dying. "What is that thing? The machine spirits, they're not responding. They're afraid. Machine spirits don't feel fear. They can't. They can when confronted with something that existed before machines, before the Omnissiah, before the Emperor, before us." The bulkhead groaned, not the sound of stress or structural failure. It groaned the way a living thing groans when it realizes it's going to die. The 3-meter-thick plasteel began to thin, atoms migrating away from a central point as if fleeing. "Move! Now!" They ran up the access tunnel, servo skulls and tech priests alike abandoning all pretense of dignity or protocol. The noospheric network was fragmenting, data streams corrupting as something incomprehensible interfaced with the sacred machine code. Talric caught glimpses of it, fragments of information that his cogitors tried to process and failed, producing error cascades that threatened to crash his entire cognitive array. Numbers that preceded mathematics, geometry that existed before space had dimension, a language written in the fundamental constants of reality itself. Behind them, the bulkhead disappeared, not destroyed. It had simply never existed. The void was perfect and absolute, a spherical absence spreading up the tunnel at walking pace, not rushing, not pursuing, just erasing, methodical and patient as entropy itself. They reached sub-level Tertius. Talric triggered every emergency seal between themselves and the excavation site. 17 bulkheads, each rated to withstand orbital bombardment. Each one held for approximately 4 seconds before the universe forgot they'd ever been built. "What are we dealing with?" Vrelix's voice cracked, her vocal augments struggling with the surge of adrenaline flooding her remaining organic systems. "Chaos? Warp contamination? Why isn't the Geller field—" "Not the warp," Talric interrupted, accessing the deepest archives in his cogitor vaults, restricted data looms that required Magos-level clearance. "This is older. The pyramid, its Necron construction, but the entity inside." His processors stuttered, struggling with the implications. "The Necrons don't imprison things lightly. They are imprisonment made manifest, their entire species locked in living metal. What would they need to cage?" The answer came from archives so old they predated the Mechanicus itself. Fragments of knowledge from the dark age of technology. Warnings encoded in human DNA like ancestral nightmares. CTan, star gods, reality eaters, beings that had fed on suns when the galaxy was young, that had shattered entire species with a thought, that were so terrifyingly powerful that even the Necrons who had conquered death itself, had been forced to shatter them into fragments and imprison those fragments in tesseract labyrinths of living metal and screaming physics. "Emperor, protect us," Vralix whispered, her remaining humanity bleeding through 2 centuries of augmentation. "We've woken a god." A fragment of one, but fragment or whole, it's loose and it's hungry. They burst into the primary excavation hub, a massive chamber carved from bedrock and reinforced with plasteel ribbing. 200 personnel looked up from their stations, tech priests, menials, servitors, all frozen in tableau as they processed the sight of their Magos Dominus running like his augmented legs were on fire. "Evacuation Protocol Omega," his amplified voice boomed through the chamber. "All personnel to surface transports, abandon all equipment, seal the Forge Temple and prepare for—" The chamber's lumens died, not flickered, not dimmed. They simply stopped having ever produced light. Darkness absolute and total swallowed the hub, broken only by the emergency glow globes and the optical implants of 36 tech priests painting the shadows with bioluminescent horror. And in that darkness, something moved. It wasn't walking, it wasn't flying, it was manifesting, reality bending around a presence that space itself rejected. Talric's enhanced vision caught it in fragments, angles that shouldn't connect, surfaces that reflected light that wasn't there, a geometry that made his organic eye bleed and his mechanical one shut itself down in self-preservation. The CTanShard stepped into the material universe, and the screaming began. The human mind was never designed to perceive a Shaitan. 60 million years ago, when these entities had walked among the stars as gods, mortal species had simply ceased when confronted with their true forms, not killed, but edited from the cosmic narrative as if they'd never drawn breath. The Necrons had learned to shatter them, to break the star gods into fragments small enough that reality could contain them, could hold them in tesseract prisons of living metal and mathematical agony. But even a fragment, even the smallest sliver of a god's consciousness was still God-shaped. And gods did not obey mortal laws. The first thing Talric-7 noticed was the wrongness of its presence. His cogitators registered spatial dimensions that shouldn't exist, not higher dimensions in the mathematical sense, but adjacent dimensions, angles perpendicular to reality itself. The shard occupied space the way a knife occupied flesh, invasively, violently, with the promise of severance. It stood 3 meters tall, though stood was the wrong word. It existed at a height of 3 meters, its form constantly shifting between states of matter that had no names in Imperial Gothic. Sometimes it appeared crystalline, faceted surfaces catching light that came from nowhere. Sometimes it seemed to be made of liquid metal that flowed upward in defiance of gravity. Sometimes it looked almost organic, almost human, a cruel joke of flesh and sinew that mocked the forms that worshipped it in the ancient past. But always, always, it looked hungry. "Omnicia, preserve us!" someone shouted, their voice breaking with religious fervor and primal terror in equal measure. Talric's tactical overlay identified the speaker. Tech Priest Moravex, 47 years of service, specialization in metallurgical analysis. He'd never raised his voice above standard Vox protocol in all that time. He raised it now. The shard noticed him. Its attention, Talric felt it like a physical weight, like being crushed under the gaze of a dying star, shifted to Moravex. The tech priest froze, his augmented limbs locking up as every servo and pneumatic system in his body simply stopped receiving signals. Then the shard fed. Moravex didn't scream. Screaming required air, required vocal cords, required a functioning nervous system. Instead, he simply began to diminish. His body remained intact, no wounds, no burns, no visible trauma, but something fundamental was being extracted. His biosigns flatlined, as in his body remained standing. His augments shut down one by one, machine spirits fleeing from a presence that predated their existence by epochs. When it was done, Moravex collapsed, not dead, worse than dead. Empty, A shell of meat and metal with nothing inside, not even the ghost of consciousness that would have allowed a proper death. The shard grew brighter, just slightly, just enough to show that it had tasted something, and the taste had pleased it. "Run!" Talric roared, all pretense of Mechanicus dignity abandoned. "Scatter! Don't group together! Make for the transit shafts!" Panic exploded through the excavation hub like a fragmenting grenade. 200 personnel bolted in every direction, training and protocol vaporizing in the face of something that made mockery of both. Servitors stood confused, their lobotomized brains unable to process commands that contradicted their core programming. Stay at station, await orders, do not flee. The shard fed on them next. 17 servitors in 3 seconds, their limited consciousness easier to consume than the screaming, desperate awareness of the unaugmented menials. Each feeding made it stronger. Each soul, if servitors could be said to have souls, was a drop of water to something that once drank stars. Talric ran, his mechadendrites slamming against the activation runes with desperate force. The massive cargo elevator groaned to life, its machine spirit sluggish and reluctant, as if it sensed what pursued them and wanted no part in this futility. 37 personnel made it to the elevator platform, 37 out of 200. The rest were scattered through the excavation hub, running, hiding, or already lying empty on the cold floor. "Seal the shaft!" Talric commanded as the elevator lurched into motion, grinding upward toward the surface 5 kilometers above. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut behind them, each one a prayer in plasteel that they all knew would prove inadequate. Through his noospheric connection, Talric could still sense the tech priests left behind. Their life signs blinked out, one by one, a cascade of deaths that his cogitators recorded with mechanical precision as his organic heart broke. And beneath it all, he felt something else, something vast and cold and impossibly ancient, stirring from a sleep that lasted since the galaxy was young. The shard was fragmentary, broken, a splinter of what it once was, but it was awake now, and it remembered being a god. The transit shaft was 4 meters wide and 5 kilometers deep, carved through solid bedrock with melta cutters over the course of 3 years. Standard Mechanicus construction, reinforced every 100 meters with plasteel bracing, equipped with emergency arrest systems, blessed by 3 different tech priests specializing in lift spirit appeasement. None of it mattered. The elevator had climbed 700 meters when the shaft itself began to scream. Not the cables, the shaft. Stone that had stood for millions of years suddenly remembered it was mortal, that it existed at the sufferance of physical laws that something below was casually rewriting. Talric gripped the safety railing, his mechadendrites anchoring him to the platform as the elevator shuddered and lurched. Around him, the survivors huddled together, tech priests, menials, even a Skitarii ranger who'd been providing security for the dig site. All of them wore the same expression, the hollow-eyed look of people who'd seen something their minds refused to process. Dominus, the Skitarii ranger, designation Theta 19, spoke through his vox grill, his augmented vocal cords steady despite the tremor in his hands. What are our defensive options? Defensive options. The question was so absurdly inadequate that Talric almost laughed. What did you defend against when your enemy existed outside the context of conventional warfare? When it didn't attack, didn't invade, but simply unmade whatever stood before it. "Prayer," Talric said flatly, "and speed. The surface is 4,000 meters up. If we can reach the Forge Temple, we can—" The elevator stopped. Not slowed, not stalled, stopped, as if every mechanical system had simultaneously decided that upward was no longer a valid direction. The machine spirit of the lift wasn't responding to his noospheric queries. It wasn't refusing commands. It was absent, fled from its housing like a frightened animal abandoning a burning den. "Manual override," Talric commanded, his mechadendrites interfacing directly with the lift's control systems. Code scrolled through his consciousness, sacred algorithms of motion and counterweight. He felt the massive gears 300 meters above, the cable drums that should have been hauling them to safety. The cables were dissolving. Not fraying, not snapping under strain. Dissolving, atom by atom, the molecular bonds that held the sacred steel simply choosing to no longer exist. In his mind's eye, through the machine touch of the noosphere, Talric watched as the cables unraveled like thread in water. "Brace!" he shouted, but there was no time. The platform dropped. 3 seconds of freefall, just 3 seconds, but when you're dropping in a shaft where gravity has become negotiable, 3 seconds can stretch like taffy. Some of the menials screamed, others prayed. Theta 19 simply locked his augmented legs and prepared for impact with the stoic acceptance of a man bred for war. The emergency arrest system engaged at 200 meters of fall. Mechanical claws shot out from the platform, grinding against the shaft walls with a shriek of tortured metal. Sparks cascaded around them like burning rain. The deceleration was brutal. 17 gravities over 2 seconds, enough to turn an unaugmented human into paste. 5 menials died instantly, their bodies pulped inside their work robes. 3 more died in the following seconds, internal organs ruptured, augments torn from their mounting points. The survivors clung to the railing, to each other, to consciousness itself. The platform settled, swaying gently in the darkness. The lumen strips had died in the fall. Only the bioluminescent glow of optical augments lit the shaft now, painting everything in sickly green and red. "Status," Talric croaked, his vox grill damaged but functional. His internal diagnostics showed 17 system failures, 3 crushed servo motors, and a hairline fracture in his spinal augmentation. Manageable. Painful, but manageable. 12 survivors, Theta 19 reported. 4 critically wounded. Current depth approximately 4,300 meters below surface level. Deeper than where they'd started. The fall had taken them down, not arrested their ascent. The laws of physics were suggestions now, easily overruled by something that had fed on the fundamental forces of the universe. Alternative routes? Tech Adept Vralik's face was pale, her remaining organic eye dilated with shock. Talric accessed the facility schematics stored in his cognitive vaults. 3 maintenance tunnels connected to the shaft at various levels. The nearest was 200 meters up. Without the elevator, without functioning climbing gear. His optical sensors adjusted to maximum sensitivity, peering up into the darkness of the shaft above them. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, movement. Not climbing, not descending, flowing. The CTanShard poured down the shaft like liquid metal, like living darkness, like the absence of hope-given physical form. It didn't obey gravity or momentum or any of the petty constraints that bound mortal matter. It simply transitioned from one location to another, reality bending to accommodate its passage. And it was coming fast. Maintenance hatch, 20 meters lateral. Talric's mechadendrites shot out, magnetic clamps engaging with the shaft wall. Theta 19, provide covering fire. Everyone else, move. Covering fire against that? The Skitari's tone suggested he understood the futility even as he raised his galvanic rifle, his targeting arrays painting the descending entity with a dozen lock-on runes. Acknowledged, Dominus. The rifle barked, sending concentrated electric death up the shaft. The round struck the shard and vanished, not deflected, not absorbed, but ceased to exist the moment they entered its spatial field. Theta 19 adjusted, firing in controlled bursts, each shot buying them 2 seconds, 3 seconds, heartbeats of time as the survivor scrambled across the swaying platform towards the maintenance hatch. Talric's mechadendrites tore the hatch open, ancient hinges shrieking in protest. Beyond lay a crawl space barely a meter wide, designed for servitors and maintenance tech priests, not a panicked evacuation of combat personnel. Go! Single file! Move! He shoved the first menial into the tunnel, then the next, his augmented strength overriding their hesitation. Vralex went third, her robes catching on the hatch frame. He tore the fabric free without ceremony. The CTanShard was 50 meters above them, 40, 30. The Skitari backed towards the hatch, his rifle overheating, barrel glowing red-hot as he poured everything he had into the descending god-fragment. His targeting computer had given up trying to track it. He was firing blind now, on faith and fury alone. "Ranger, now!" Talric roared. The Skitari dove for the hatch. Talric caught him, mechadendrites wrapping around the Skitari's torso, hauling him into the crawl space, even as the platform behind them ceased to exist. One moment it was there, 2 tons of blessed steel and sacred engineering. The next moment, there was simply void, a perfect sphere of non-existence hanging in the shaft where their salvation had been. They crawled. In the darkness, in the tight confines of a maintenance tunnel that suddenly felt like a coffin, they crawled away from something that had drunk stars and now hungered for the faint candle flames of their souls. Behind them, the crawl space began to narrow. Not collapse, narrow. Space itself was being edited, rewritten, compressed by something that found the concept of distance to be a quaint mortal delusion. And in the darkness, they heard it. Not a sound, not a vibration, but a presence in the noospherum, in the machine code of reality itself. The CTanShard was speaking in a language older than language, broadcasting in frequencies that his augments tried desperately not to translate. But translate they did, just enough for him to understand. I am hungry. The maintenance tunnel terminated in a junction chamber, barely large enough for 3 people to stand upright. Talric emerged first, his augmented limbs scraping against corroded metal, his robes torn and soaked with sacred oils leaking from damaged servomotors. Behind him came the others, 11 survivors now. One menial having simply stopped in the tunnel, his consciousness snuffed out without the shard even touching him, as if proximity alone had been enough to drain whatever spark animated his flesh. "Seal it," Talric commanded, his mechadendrites already interfacing with the junction's door controls. Ancient machinery groaned to life, and a blast door 300 years old ground closed with the tortured shriek of neglected metal. It wouldn't hold. Nothing would hold. But perhaps it would buy them minutes. Perhaps minutes would be enough. The junction chamber was a relic of earlier excavation phases, walls covered in cogitator terminals that hadn't been active in decades. Emergency lumen strips flickered weakly, casting everything in the anemic amber of dying light. The air tasted of rust and stale recycle scrubbers, of a place abandoned to time and entropy. Theta 19 checked his galvanic rifle. The weapon was half melted, the barrel warped from sustained firing at temperatures it was never designed to endure. He ejected the power cell, depleted, and loaded his last spare with the mechanical precision of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. Ammunition status, critical. Combat effectiveness, minimal. Estimated survival probability against observed threat, 0.03%. Your optimism is noted, Ranger, Talric replied, accessing the junction's ancient cogitator systems. Dead terminals flickered to life under his touch, machine spirits responding sluggishly to his authority codes. Vralix, I need a route to the surface, any route, maintenance shafts, ventilation ducts, emergency tunnels, anything that connects to... The blast door rippled. Solid plasteel, 40 centimeters thick, certified to withstand melter charges and crack missiles. It rippled like water disturbed by a stone, concentric waves spreading from a central point where reality had decided it no longer cared about material properties. Contact in 20 seconds, Theta 19 reported unnecessarily. His rifle tracked the door, steady as a turret mount, despite the futility radiating from every sensor reading. Vralix's hands flew across a corroded terminal, her remaining organic fingers bleeding where rust had cut through gloves. There, Service Tunnel 7 Gamma, 15 meters north. It connects to a geothermal vent shaft that leads to... She paused, her face falling. Sub-level Secundus, still 2 kilometers below surface. 2 kilometers. 2,000 meters of rock and steel between them and salvation, and behind them something that treated distance as a polite suggestion it was under no obligation to follow. It will have to suffice, Talric said, pulling the schematics into his cognitive array. The route was there, barely. Sections showed red in his mind's eye, warning of structural instability, of passages that might have collapsed in the centuries since they were mapped. But red was better than the void black of non-existence that was spreading up from the depths. The blast door began to thin, atoms migrating, molecular bonds loosening, steel becoming gossamer, becoming memory, becoming nothing. Move! Talric shoved the nearest menial toward the junction's north exit, a circular hatch, barely a meter across. Theta 19, rear guard. Vralix, lead the evacuation. Dominus! One of the menials, a young woman barely 20 standard years, grabbed his robe with bloodied hands. We can't outrun it! It's toying with us! Please, we have to... Her voice cracked, hysteria bubbling up through flesh. Talric's mechadendrites gripped her shoulders, gentle but firm. We run because the alternative is to empty our skulls and wait for it to feast. We run because we are servants of the Omnissiah, and he does not teach surrender. We run because while we live, we deny its satisfaction. Do you understand? She nodded, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. Young, too young. Most of the Mechanicus excavation team had been veterans, centuries-old tech priests who'd seen 1,000 dig sites. This girl had probably signed on as general labor, dreaming of advancement through the priesthood, imagining a future of sacred knowledge and mechanical enlightenment. She'd gotten a god instead. The blast door disappeared. Not exploded inward, not breached. It simply wasn't anymore.
and in the space where it had been stood the CTanShard. It had grown, fed on servitors and tech priests and menials. It had grown, now standing nearly 4 meters tall, its form stabilizing into something almost comprehensible. Almost. It wore the shape of humanoid like a cruel joke, a parody of flesh that mocked everything organic. Its surface shifted between states, crystalline facets that reflected light from impossible angles, liquid metal that flowed upward in defiance of gravity, segments of what might have been living tissue if tissue could exist without cells or DNA or any of the chemical processes that defined life. But the worst part was its eyes, if they were eyes. Apertures in its approximation of a face, geometric voids that seemed to look through matter, through time, through the thin veneer of reality into the screaming chaos beneath. Talric tore his optics away before the contact could unmake him. "Go!" Theta 19 opened fire. The galvanic rifle roared, electrical death lancing across the junction chamber, rounds that could punch through ceramite armor and liquefy augmented flesh. They hit the shard and ceased, popping out of existence like soap bubbles against a flame. The shard didn't even acknowledge the attack. It stepped forward, space folded, and it was simply closer, crossed 3 meters without traversing the distance between. Its attention fixed on the fleeing menials, on the young woman who was scrambling toward the north hatch with survival instinct overriding her exhausted limbs. "No," Talric whispered, then louder, "No!" His plasma caster fired without conscious thought, centuries of combat programming overriding the logical understanding that it was useless. Superheated matter crossed the junction chamber at a fraction of light speed, a star-hot bolt of fury and desperation. It struck the shard's center mass, and something unexpected happened. The plasma didn't vanish. It splashed, spreading across the shard's surface like water against stone. For a fraction of a second, less than a heartbeat, the entity flinched, not damaged, not wounded, but inconvenienced, as if the plasma contained something it couldn't immediately edit from existence. Energy, pure energy, matter converted to its most fundamental state, the raw stuff of the universe before it cooled enough to form atoms and molecules and the physical laws that the CTan had spent eternity devouring. It couldn't unmake energy as easily as it unmade matter. It had to consume it, process it, digest it like food, rather than simply deleting it from the cosmic ledger. The flinch lasted a microsecond. Then the shard focused on Talric, and he felt the weight of a god's attention like a mountain pressing against his consciousness.
But a microsecond was enough. The menials reached the hatch. Vrelix hauled the young woman through, then 2 more survivors, then she was through herself and sealing it from the other side. Theta 19 backed toward the hatch, his rifle overheating again, power cells screaming toward critical failure. "Dominus, move!" Talric fired his plasma caster again and again, emptying the weapon's core in a desperate bid to buy seconds, to give his people time to flee into the depths of Arcturus Prime, and perhaps find a way to survive what he had unleashed. The shard advanced. Not hurried, not concerned. It had all the time in the universe. It had made the universe, or something like it, back when galaxies were young and mortals were food. Talric's foot touched the hatch rim. Theta 19 grabbed his robes and hauled, and together they tumbled backward into the service tunnel. As the plasma caster finally died, its machine spirit fled, its core depleted. Behind them, the CTanShard reached the hatch and paused. For one eternal moment it stood there, studying the opening with something that might have been curiosity. Its form flickered through 17 different states of matter, settling finally on something almost solid, almost real. Then it began to compress itself, folding its impossible geometry to fit through a space far too small, because size was just another mortal delusion, and gods did not obey such constraints. Talric sealed the hatch and ran into the darkness, knowing with absolute certainty that nowhere in this world, in any world, was far enough to run.
Service Tunnel 7 Gamma had been designed for automated servitors, not panicked humans fleeing from cosmic horror. The passage was barely 1.5 meters tall, forcing everyone to crouch as they scrambled through the darkness. Emergency lighting had failed decades ago. Only the bioluminescent glow of augmented eyes and the occasional flickering lumen strip provided illumination, casting monstrous shadows that seemed to reach with grasping fingers. Talric counted heads as they ran. 9 survivors, 9 out of 300 personnel who'd been working the excavation site just 17 minutes ago. His chronometer insisted it had only been 17 minutes. His organic brain insisted it had been 17 years. Behind them, the service tunnel was collapsing. Not structural failure, ontological failure. Reality itself was coming apart at the seams, unraveling like rotten fabric as the CTanShard forced its way through spaces that rejected its existence. Metal screamed, stone wept. The tunnel walls developed impossible angles that hurt to look at, geometry that made his optics stutter and crash. "Geothermal vent shaft 30 meters, Virilix gasped, her respiratory augments laboring. Even augmented lungs struggled when the air itself was trying to decide whether it still wanted to be air. "But Dominus, the heat signatures, the shaft is active. Temperatures exceed 400 degrees, without proper shielding." "Burns or feeding," Theta 19 said flatly, his rifle now slung across his back. "Useless. Choose." The choice was no choice at all. They emerged into a vertical shaft 20 meters across, and the heat hit them like a physical blow. Arcturus Prime was a forge world. Its mantle had been deliberately cracked centuries ago to provide geothermal power for the manufactorums above. This shaft was one of dozens that channeled superheated air from the planet's molten core to the surface cooling arrays. The temperature was murderous. Talric's external sensors registered 437 degrees and climbing. His robes began to smolder immediately. Around him, the unaugmented menials screamed as their skin blistered, as their hair ignited, as moisture boiled from their eyes. "Climb!" Talric roared over the sound of rushing air and human agony. There, his Mechanics pointed to a maintenance ladder running up the shaft's interior, ferrocrete rungs jutting from the wall, designed for servitors with heat-resistant plating, not flesh and bone. The young menial woman, he still didn't know her name, reached the ladder first and grabbed the lowest rung. Her palms sizzled against the metal. She screamed, but she held on, and then she was climbing, her body driven by survival instinct that overrode the nerve signal shrieking that she was burning alive. One by one they climbed. Talric used his Mechanics to boost the others up, his augmented limbs better suited to the heat than fragile human flesh. Virilix's hands were smoking, organic tissue charring even through her work gloves. A male menial, middle-aged with basic ocular augments, made it 5 rungs up before his strength failed. He fell, and Theta 19 caught him with augmented reflexes, shoved him back onto the ladder with the cold efficiency of a man who'd saved dying comrades 1,000 times.
"Climb or die here," the Centauri barked. "Choose quickly. I have no interest in carrying corpses." The choice was no choice at all. Talric was last to reach the ladder, his optical sensors painting the service tunnel behind them in thermal green and infrared red. The tunnel was 30 meters away, 20, 15. The walls were developing that telltale shimmer, reality becoming negotiable as something impossible forced its way through. His Mechanics gripped the ladder rungs, ceramite and blessed steel better suited to the heat than flesh, and he began to climb. The shaft stretched above them, 2 kilometers of vertical hell, rungs spaced every meter, each one hot enough to sear meat from bone. His augmented physiology could handle it. Barely. The menials couldn't. Even Virilix with her extensive augmentation was struggling. Her cooling systems overwhelmed, her organic components cooking inside her own body. But they climbed anyway, because humans were remarkably stubborn about refusing to die when something told them they should. 100 meters up, 200 meters. The heat was becoming bearable as they climbed away from the source, temperatures dropping from instantly fatal to merely slowly fatal. Talric's internal cogitators calculated survival odds, factoring in burn trauma, heat exhaustion, and the structural integrity of a ladder that hadn't been maintained in... The shaft pulsed. Not shook, not trembled, pulsed, as if the entire geological structure had suddenly become a living thing with a heartbeat. Temperature spiked, 600 degrees, 700 degrees, numbers that turned atmosphere into plasma and metal into vapor. But they weren't vaporizing. The heat wasn't increasing, it was being redistributed, pulled downward like water down a drain, sucked towards something up the base of the shaft that was feeding on thermal energy the way humans fed on air. The CTanShard emerged into the geothermal vent. Talric's optical sensors caught it through the distortion of superheated air. The entity had changed again, grown again, fed enough to stabilize its form into something more coherent. It stood at the base of the shaft, 5 meters tall now. Its body was a constantly shifting amalgamation of states that shouldn't coexist. Solid and liquid and plasma and something beyond all three. Something that existed in states of matter that had no names because they violated thermodynamics at a fundamental level. And it was drinking the heat. The shaft's geothermal energy poured into it like water into sand. Endless calories of thermal power being absorbed, processed, converted into whatever sustained a god-fragment's impossible existence. "It's feeding on the forge world itself," Talric whispered, horror cutting through his augmented emotional dampers. "It doesn't need flesh anymore. It can feed on energy, on heat, on the planet's core if we let it reach it." The Shard looked up. Its gaze, if those geometric voids could be called a gaze, tracked the ladder, the climbing figures, the desperate mortals who thought they could flee from a being that had chased prey across galactic distances. Then it began to climb. Not using the ladder, not pulling itself up rung by rung. It simply transitioned upward, reality folding to allow it passage, space compressing as it covered 10 meters, 20 meters, 50 meters in heartbeats. Distance was meaningless. Gravity was a suggestion. The physical laws that bound mortals to linear motion were cosmic jokes it had stopped laughing at 60 million years ago. "Faster," Talric roared, though faster meant nothing when your pursuer existed outside the context of velocity and acceleration. 300 meters to the next junction. Move! But they were moving. The menials climbed with reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. Hands blistered and bleeding, lungs scorched by superheated air, bodies pushed past every limit organic flesh had evolved to handle. The young woman was flagging. Talric could see it. Her grip weakening, her movements becoming uncoordinated as shock and exhaustion overwhelmed her system.
She was 2 rungs below Virilix, 5 above Theta 19, and she was dying, her body shutting down one system at a time. "Stay with us," Talric called out. "What's your name, menial?" "Serena," she gasped, the word barely audible over the roaring wind of the shaft. "Serena Valderis. I'm 22 standard years. I'm from Hive Tertius. I have a sister. Her name is—" The shard was 100 meters below them. 90, 80. "Tell me about your sister," Talric commanded, using his vox grill to amplify his voice, to cut through the wind and the terror and give her something, anything to focus on besides the burning and the climbing and the thing that was coming.
"Younger," Serena sobbed, still climbing. "Her name is Maris. She's 17. She wanted to join the excavation too, but I told her to stay home, to wait until—" Her voice cracked. "I told her I'd come back. I promised I'd come back." The shard was 50 meters below. Its form flickered, cycling through configurations that made the shaft walls ripple in sympathy, that turned the air into something thick and resistant, almost liquid. "Then you'll keep that promise," Talric said, and fired his graviton projector. The weapon was a last resort, designed for manipulating heavy machinery and collapsing tunnel systems in emergencies. He'd never fired it at a living target, never had reason to. But the CTan wasn't living, not in any sense that mattered, and desperate times had rendered conventional wisdom obsolete approximately 17 minutes and 300 lives ago. The graviton beam hit the shard's center mass, and local space-time convulsed. Gravity inverted, multiplied, folded in on itself like origami made from fundamental forces. The shard fell upward, then sideways, then in directions that didn't have names, caught in an eddy of warped physics that even its reality editing couldn't immediately compensate for. It bought them 10 seconds, maybe 15. They reached the junction. A maintenance platform jutted from the shaft wall, 5 square meters of blessed solid metal with an access hatch leading deeper into Arcturus Prime's subterranean labyrinth. Theta 19 reached it first, hauled Serena up with one augmented arm, then Vrelix, then the others in rapid succession. Talric was last again, his mechadendrites gripping the platform edge as the graviton effect faded below. The shard recovered, its form stabilizing, and it resumed its climb with the patient inevitability of entropy itself. They sealed the hatch, plastisteel, 2 meters thick, blessed by Magos Metallurgicus Horvath himself during the platform's consecration 40 years ago. It wouldn't hold. Nothing held. But it would buy them minutes. And in those minutes, Talric accessed what remained of the facility's noospheric network and sent out a signal on every frequency the Mechanicus used, every channel that might reach the surface, might reach orbit, might reach someone who could help. The message was simple. Alert. CTan manifestation. Arcturus Prime compromised. Request immediate Astartes intervention. May the Omnissiah preserve us all. The distress signal crawled through Arcturus Prime's compromised communication network like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Talric felt it through the noosphere, data packets fragmenting and reassembling, vox channels corrupted by electromagnetic interference from the geothermal vents, emergency protocols triggering across 17 sublevels as cogitators registered catastrophic system failures below ground. The signal would reach the surface, eventually. Whether anyone would believe it was another matter entirely. "CTan," Ralix whispered, slumped against the junction wall, her hands wrapped in torn strips of robe to cover the burns. "I studied xenotech for 70 years, Dominus.
Necron artifacts, phase iron analysis, tesseract labyrinth theory, but I never thought they're supposed to be theoretical, ancient history, dead gods from a dead age.
Dead things stay buried, Theta 19 said, checking the other survivors for injuries. 3 of the menials were in shock, eyes glazed, bodies trembling. Serena was conscious but barely, her breathing shallow, her skin mottled with second-degree burns. This thing isn't dead, it's starving. Talric's cogitators agreed with the assessment. Everything he'd witnessed matched the fragmentary records from the War in Heaven, that apocalyptic conflict 60 million years ago, when the CTan had fed on the souls of the living Necron tier, when star gods had walked among mortals and entire species had been rendered extinct between one breath and the next. The Necrons had eventually rebelled, shattered their gods into fragments, imprisoned those fragments in tesseract mazes of living metal and impossible mathematics. But fragments were still dangerous. A single shard could consume a world if left unchecked, and this one had been starved for 60 million years. The hatch groaned. Metal stress indicators spiked across Talric's tactical overlay. The shard wasn't even touching it yet. Its mere proximity was enough to make the plasteel doubt its own structural integrity. "We need to keep moving," Talric said, accessing the facility schematic database. 2 kilometers to surface, multiple route options, but all of them pass through populated sectors. He paused, the implications settling like lead in his organic stomach. "If we lead it through inhabited zones, then people die," Theta 19 finished. "But if we don't reach the surface to coordinate evacuation, everyone dies. Basic tactical calculation, Dominus. Save who you can, mourn the rest later." Cold logic. Skitari logic. The mathematics of acceptable losses that the Astra Militarum had perfected over 10,000 years of endless war. Talric had always found it distasteful, had prided himself on solving problems without sacrificing personnel unnecessarily. But this wasn't a problem with an elegant solution. This was triage on a planetary scale. "Route designation Septimus," he said, pulling up a tunnel network that bypassed the primary residential hubs. "Skeletal maintenance crews only. We evacuate them if possible, seal bulkheads behind us, and—" The hatch screamed. Not the sound of metal failing, the sound of metal remembering it was temporary, that entropy claimed all things, that even blessed steel was just organized atoms held together by electromagnetic forces that could be edited by something with sufficient will and hunger. "Go!" Talric shoved the nearest menial toward the maintenance corridor. "Theta 19, take point. Vrelix, middle position. I'll bring up the rear and seal—" The hatch disappeared. Between 1 microsecond and the next, 2 meters of consecrated plasteel simply wasn't. No explosion, no debris, just absence. A perfectly circular void where Imperial craftsmanship had stood for 40 years. The CTanShard stood in the absence, and it was beautiful. Talric hated that his optical sensors registered it as beautiful, that his pattern recognition subroutines found aesthetic pleasure in the entity's geometries, but it was beautiful. The way a supernova was beautiful, the way entropy was beautiful, the terrible perfection of a thing that existed exactly as it was meant to exist, unburdened by morality or mercy or any of the constraints that made lesser beings tolerable. Its form had stabilized further. 7 meters tall now, humanoid in the way that a sculpture was humanoid, suggesting the shape without being constrained by the reality of flesh and bone.
Its surface rippled with fractal patterns that hurt to track, recursive geometries that folded into themselves in violation of three-dimensional space. Where it stood, the air crystallized and shattered, reformed and shattered again, caught in a perpetual cycle of creation and destruction. And it was looking at Serena. The young woman had collapsed against the corridor wall, her strength finally depleted, her body shutting down from trauma and exhaustion. She stared at the shard with eyes that had gone beyond fear into something approaching acceptance, or maybe just shock. It was hard to tell when someone's higher brain functions were drowning in agony. "No," Talric said quietly. Then louder, stepping between Serena and the entity. "No!" His plasma caster was depleted. His graviton projector had maybe one shot left before its power core failed. His mechanodendrites could lift 3 tons, but what good was strength against something that ate physics for breakfast? He fired the graviton projector anyway. The beam caught the shard in what might have been its torso, and reality hiccuped, gravity inverted in a 3-meter sphere around the entity, space-time compressing, trying to fold the impossible creature into a singularity that would trap it outside normal existence. The shard laughed. Not sound, not vocalization, but a pulse of contempt that radiated through the noosphere, through the electromagnetic spectrum, through dimensions human science hadn't named. Talric felt it in his augments, in his organic neurons, in the space between thought and action. The graviton field collapsed. The shard had simply refused to acknowledge it, rejected the mathematics that made gravity function, and reality apologized for the inconvenience. Then Theta 19 opened fire. His galvanic rifle was depleted, but he'd switched to his auxiliary armament, a standard-issue Mechanicus arc pistol, blessed weapon dating back 2 centuries, passed down through 17 Skitarii generations. The electrical discharge lanced across the corridor, struck the shard, and
Again. Just like with the plasma fire, energy, raw and unprocessed, was harder for it to edit. It had to consume energy, digest it through whatever processes sustained a god-fragment's existence. And consumption took time, even if that time was measured in microseconds. "Energy weapons," Talric roared. "Anything that produces heat, electricity, radiation, fire!" The surviving tech priests opened up with whatever they had: arc welders, plasma torches, even a handheld las cutter that one menial had grabbed during the initial evacuation. Beams of pure energy crisscrossed the corridor, painting everything in strobing white and electric blue. The shard didn't retreat, didn't flee, but slowed, forced to process the incoming energy rather than simply deleting it from existence. Its shard flickered, destabilized, cycling through configurations as it adapted to the assault. "Run!" Theta 19 barked, his arc pistol overheating, power cells screaming toward critical failure. You'll buy us nothing if you die here." Talric's mechadendrites wrapped around the Skitari's torso and pulled, hauling him backward down the corridor as he continued firing one-handed. "We run together or not at all." They ran. Through maintenance corridors that hadn't seen human traffic in decades, past rusted machinery and corroded ventilation systems, through the forgotten arteries of a forge world that had prioritized production over preservation. Emergency lighting flickered overhead, dying lumen strips that cast everything in amber and shadow. Behind them, the CTanShard followed, not pursuing, not chasing, just following, patient as a predator that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. Talric's tactical overlay showed their route, 600 meters to the abandoned manufactorum level, another kilometer beyond that to the primary transit hub that could take them to the surface. If the transit hub still functioned, if the shard didn't simply erase it from existence, if any of the 17 layers of if that separated them from salvation held long enough to matter. They rounded a corner and nearly collided with a maintenance crew, 8 servitors and 2 tech priests conducting routine diagnostics on a Prometheum distribution node. The tech priests looked up, registered the running survivors, the burns and the terror, and the Magos Dominus himself, fleeing like a penitent before the Emperor's judgment. "Evacuate," Talric gasped. "Alert everyone on this level. Seal all access points. Get to the surface and—" The corridor behind them went dark. Not a power failure. Dark, as if light itself had decided this particular stretch of space wasn't worth illuminating anymore. And in that darkness, something moved. Something 7 meters tall that treated the corridor like an interesting suggestion rather than a physical constraint. Something that had followed them through 2 kilometers of Arcturus Proun's depths and was now growing tired of the game. The tech priests saw it, saw what stood in the darkness, what defied every law they'd spent centuries cataloging and understanding. One of them started screaming, high-pitched, sustained, the sound of a logical mind breaking under the weight of incomprehensible reality. The other ran for an alarm panel, his mechandendrites flying across the controls, triggering every warning klaxon on the level. The shard fed on him first. The screaming tech priest survived 7 seconds longer, which was more mercy than most received. And somewhere far above, on the surface of Arcturus Prime, where the sky burned with industrial haze and the manufactorums churned out weapons for the Emperor's endless wars, Talric's distress signal finally reached its destination. A Space Marine strike cruiser in low orbit, conducting routine patrol of the sector, received the transmission. The message was read. Protocols were engaged, and in the cruiser's deployment bay, warriors in power armor began their pre-combat rites, checking weapons that had killed Xenos across 100 worlds, preparing to face something that most of the Imperium believed was myth. They would arrive in 30 minutes. The question was whether anyone would still be alive to greet them. The alarm klaxons transformed the abandoned manufactorum level into a chorus of mechanical screaming. Vox grills throughout the section blared warnings in binary cant and high Gothic. Automated systems doing what they were designed to do. Alert personnel to danger. Initiate evacuation protocols. Seal contamination zones. But contamination protocols assumed biological threats, chemical spills, reactor breaches. They assumed dangers that obeyed physical laws. The bulkheads grinding shot throughout the level were rated for pressure differentials, radiation exposure, even limited void exposure. They weren't rated for gods. Talric sprinted through the manufactorum floor, his augmented legs burning through power reserves at unsustainable rates. Around him stretched the skeletal remains of production lines that had once forged ammunition for the Imperial Guard. Massive conveyor systems now rusted silent. Assembly servitors slumped in their stations like mechanical corpses. Promethium tanks drained and corroded by decades of neglect. Serena stumbled. Ralix caught her, hauled her upright with strength that augmentation shouldn't have provided, adrenaline and desperation overriding every safety limiter in her system. "Stay with us. The transit hub is close." "I can't." Serena's voice was barely a whisper. "Just leave me. I'm slowing you down. My sister, tell her." "You'll tell her yourself," Theta 19 snapped, his arc pistol sweeping the manufactorum shadows. "In 30 minutes, Astartes arrive. In 30 minutes, we have gods of our own. You survive 30 minutes, you survive forever. Move!" 30 minutes. The number was a prayer and a curse. The Astartes were coming, warriors who'd faced chaos demons and tyrannid biotitans and orc war bosses that could tear through ceramite with their bare hands. Surely they could handle a CTanShard. Surely the Emperor's finest could cage a god-fragment that even the Necrons had managed to imprison. Surely. Behind them, a bulkhead ceased to exist, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession, void spheres spreading through the manufactorum level like cancer through flesh. The CTanShard was no longer following patiently. It was accelerating, its hunger overriding whatever cosmic calculation had made it toy with them before. Or perhaps it sensed the approaching space marines. Perhaps it remembered, in whatever passed for memory in a shattered god's consciousness, that the last time the Imperium's warriors had faced CTanShards, they'd brought planet-killing weapons and paid in millions of lives for each fragment caged. Perhaps it wanted to feed as much as possible before the real fight began. "Transit hub 100 meters, Tauric's tactical overlay painted the route through the manufactorum, past the silent production lines, through a cargo loading zone, up a service ramp to the primary transportation level. From there, high-speed rail lines connected to the surface, magnetic acceleration systems that could move them 3 kilometers in under 2 minutes. If the rail line still functioned, if the power grid wasn't compromised, if the CTanShard gave them 2 minutes. They burst through the cargo loading zone, past containers that had sat unopened for decades, past servitor charging stations that hadn't seen use since the manufactorum's closure. Emergency lighting strobed overhead, amber turning to red as proximity sensors detected something they couldn't categorize approaching from behind. The service ramp loomed ahead, a 45-degree incline rising 20 meters to the transit level. Stairs for human personnel ran parallel to the ramp, but stairs required time and strength that none of them possessed. "Hold on," Talric commanded. His mechanodendrites shot out, gripping the nearest survivors, Serena, 2 menials, and Vralix, while Theta 19 grabbed 2 more. Then he activated his magnetic climbing clamps and scaled the ramp, augmented limbs pulling them upward at speeds that would have torn unaugmented humans apart. They reached the top in 7 seconds. 7 seconds of vertical climbing, while behind them, the manufactorum floor began to tilt, geometry warping as something impossible compressed space to shorten its pursuit distance. The transit hub was a cathedral of steel and purpose. 50 meters high, 200 meters long, the chamber housed 6 parallel maglev rail lines that connected the deep excavation levels to Arcturus Prime's surface installations. Maintenance gantries crisscrossed overhead. Hololithic display boards, most of them dead, lined the walls. And on track Tertius, still connected to its power feed, sat a cargo transport pod designed to carry 50 tons of ore or equipment.
or 9 desperate survivors running from a god. "Get it powered up!" Talric roared, his mechanodendrites interfacing with the pod's control systems. Ancient machine spirits stirred, sluggish from decades of intermittent use. He flooded them with activation codes, priority overrides, emergency authority protocols that dated back to the Mechanicus' founding charter. Wake up, and move, because if you don't, we all die, and I will not let my failure be the reason this thing reaches the surface." The machine spirit heard him, felt his desperation through the noosphere, the raw human terror bleeding through 2 centuries of augmentation. Power systems groaned to life. Magnetic coils hummed, building charge. The pod's doors ground open with a shriek of protesting metal. "Inside! Everyone inside!" Theta 19 practically threw the menials through the door, then Vralex, then Serena, who could barely stand. He followed last, his arc pistol aimed back at the service ramp, tracking for movement. Movement found them. The CTanShard rose into view at the top of the ramp. Not climbed, rose, as if the concept of ramp and incline were quaint suggestions it had decided to ignore. Its form had changed again, less humanoid now, more abstract, a configuration of impossible angles and surfaces that looked almost mechanical, almost like the Necron constructs that had imprisoned it eons ago. It had consumed enough, fed enough. It was remembering what it used to be, before the shattering, before the imprisonment. It was remembering when it had walked among stars and drunk their light, when species had worshipped it as a god and learned too late that gods cared nothing for their prayers. Talric sealed the pod door and prayed to a different god, the Omnissiah, the machine god, the aspect of the Emperor that blessed technology and granted wisdom to those who served. He prayed his way through the activation sequence, through the power of protocols, through the 17-step safety checklist that the machine spirit insisted on completing before it would engage the magnetic acceleration. The CTanShard began crossing the transit hub floor. Each step left void prints behind, perfectly circular absences in the rockcrete that would never fill, that would remain as scars in reality itself until the end of time. 50 meters away. 40. 30. "Move!" Talric roared at the machine spirit, at the magnetic coils, at the universe itself. The pod moved. Magnetic acceleration hit them like the fist of an angry god. 17 gravities in 1 second. Enough to liquefy unaugmented organs and shatter unprotected bones. The survivors screamed, some of them blacked out. Theta 19 locked his augmented legs and held position, his combat programming overriding the impulse to collapse. Talric's cogitators registered the CTanShard lunging forward, its form blurring as it attempted to cross the remaining distance, to reach the pod before acceleration carried them beyond its immediate reach. It missed, by less than a meter, by microseconds. But in those microseconds, the pod entered the maglev acceleration tunnel and screamed toward the surface at 400 kilometers per hour. Magnetic fields powerful enough to levitate 50 tons of cargo, pulling them upward through Arcturus Prime's depths. Through his connection to the transit system, Talric felt the CTanShard's presence behind them, felt it step onto Tertius and begin following, its impossible form somehow interfacing with the magnetic rails, using the very technology that was supposed to save them to accelerate its own pursuit. It was learning, adapting, growing stronger with each feeding, with each moment of freedom from its tesseract prison. In 60 million years of imprisonment, it had forgotten how to interact with the physical universe. Now it was remembering, quickly.
"Time to surface," Theta-19 asked, his vocal synthesizer steady despite the G-forces. 90 seconds, Talric replied, watching the distance markers flash past on his tactical overlay. Transit Station Beta-7, Primary Manufactory Complex, Civilian Population, approximately 40,000, Military Garrison, 1 company of Skitari, PDF Reinforcement Regiment, and, he paused, hope surging through his circuits. And whatever Space Marines have already made planetfall. If they had made planetfall. If they'd received the distress signal in time to deploy immediately rather than conducting reconnaissance first. If. The pod rocketed through the tunnel, emergency lighting strobing past in amber streaks. Behind them, Talric could sense it through the maglev system's machine spirits. The CTanShard followed, its presence corrupting sensor readings, making the tunnel walls doubt their own existence. 60 seconds to surface. 60 seconds until they breached into Arcturus Prime's toxic atmosphere and found out whether salvation waited or whether they'd simply condemned 40,000 souls to the same fate that had claimed 300 excavation personnel. Serena was weeping, her burned hands pressed against her face. Vrelix had her arms around the young woman, offering what comfort augmented limbs could provide. The other menials huddled together, beyond terror now, existing in that numb space where the mind simply stopped processing horror and accepted whatever came next. Theta-19 checked his arc pistol one final time. Power cell at 7%. Maybe 20 shots. Maybe 15. Enough to die fighting, which is all any Skitari asked from the universe. 30 seconds. The tunnel began to angle upward, magnetic acceleration compensating for the incline, pulling them toward the surface with relentless force. Through the pod's reinforced viewports, Talric caught glimpses of the tunnel walls, rockcrete and plasteel giving way to reinforced ceramite as they approached inhabited levels, as they climbed toward zones where 40,000 people lived and worked and had no idea what was rising from the depths below. 15 seconds. The CTanShard was gaining. Talric felt it through the machine spirits, felt their terror as something impossible, used their sacred rails to propel itself faster than magnetic levitation should allow. It was learning from the technology, understanding it, improving it, turning humanity's own achievements against them. 5 seconds. Light. Real light, not emergency amber, but the sodium yellow glow of manufactorium illumination, the toxic orange of Arcturus Prime's industrial sky, visible through ventilation grates above. They burst from the tunnel into Transit Station Beta-7 and found the Space Marines waiting. They were angels of death. That was the first coherent thought Talric's cogitators produced as the maglev plod shrieked to a halt in Transit Station Beta-7. Through the viewport, he saw them. 10 warriors in power armor, the color of burnished bronze. Chapter insignia he didn't immediately recognize emblazoned on their pauldrons. Each stood over 2 meters tall, gene-enhanced demigods wrapped in ceramite and fury, bolt guns held with the casual competence of beings who'd killed for centuries. The squad sergeant stepped forward, his helmet's optical arrays focusing on the pod with targeting precision that would have been terrifying under other circumstances. His voice, amplified through vox grills and carrying the weight of absolute authority, cut through the station's alarm klaxons. "Identify yourselves. You have 3 seconds." Talric triggered the pod door, stumbled out on legs that weren't quite steady, and raised his hands in a gesture that transcended military protocol and entered the realm of universal supplication. "Magos Dominus Talric-7, Mechanicus Excavation Team. We're pursued by..." The maglev tunnel pulsed. Every space marine in the squad snapped their weapons toward the tunnel entrance. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, the product of hypno-conditioning and decades of combat experience. No hesitation, no fear, just instant readiness to kill whatever emerged. "By what?" the sergeant demanded, his bolt gun steady as granite. "CTanShard," Talric said, and watched every space marine in the squad stiffen. "Necron god-fragment, tesseract labyrinth compromised during excavation. 300 souls consumed. It's been feeding for 18 minutes. Interrupted a new voice, another space marine, this one wearing the robes and iconography of a librarian. The chapter psychers, warriors who wielded the warp as easily as their battle brothers wielded bolters. His armor was decorated with purity seals and psychic wards, and his eyes, visible through his helmet's optical slits, glowed with unnatural blue light. "You are telling the truth, Magos. I taste the residue of its presence on your soul. You've looked into something that predates the warp itself, and the experience has marked you." "Can you stop it?" Talric asked, desperation bleeding through his vox grill. "Your order has faced CTan before. There are records, protocols, weapons. Records of millions dead. Protocols that involve orbital bombardment and cyclonic torpedoes. Weapons we don't carry on a routine patrol mission." He paused, his helmet tilting slightly as he processed tactical data. "But we are Astartes. We are the Emperor's wrath made manifest. If it can bleed, we can kill it." "It doesn't bleed," Theta 19 said, limping out of the pod, his arc pistol still clutched in one hand. "Matter ceases to exist in its presence. Energy it consumes. We hit it with everything from plasma to graviton, and it adapted within seconds." The librarian nodded slowly. "CTan exist outside the warp. They are anathema to chaos, yes, but also to all things that rely on the immaterium for power. My psychic abilities will be useless, perhaps worse than useless. Attempting to strike at something that exists in pure materium might create feedback that..." The tunnel pulsed again, harder. The maglev rails began to hum, magnetic fields activating without input from control systems. Something was using them, manipulating them, accelerating toward the surface with purpose and hunger. "Evacuate the transit station," the sergeant commanded, his voice cutting through vox channels to every Imperial authority in range. "PDF units, begin immediate civilian withdrawal from the primary manufacturing complex. Magos, get your people to safety. Librarian Zareth, establish a psychic cordon. I know it won't stop the entity, but perhaps you can mask our presence long enough to..." "Contact!" shouted one of the Space Marines, his auspex screaming proximity warnings. The CTanShard emerged from the maglev tunnel like a serpent from its den. It had grown, fed on 300 souls, on thermal energy from the geothermal vents and on the ambient radiation of Arcturus Prime's toxic atmosphere. It stood 9 meters tall now, too large for the tunnel, its form compressed in ways that violated geometry as it squeezed through space that shouldn't have contained it. Then it unfolded. Reality screamed as the shard expanded to its full dimensions. The transit station ceiling, reinforced plasteel rated for orbital strikes, simply wasn't anymore, edited from existence to accommodate a being that refused to acknowledge architectural constraints. Through the new absence, Talric could see Arcturus Prime's sky, the toxic orange clouds, and the silhouettes of Manufactorum spires that reached toward the heavens like iron prayers. The Space Marines opened fire. 10 bolt guns, each firing 0.98 caliber mass reactive rounds at 4,500 meters per second. Explosive death crossed the transit station in a storm of consecrated fury. Each bolt was blessed, sanctified, carved with litanies that invoked the Emperor's wrath and promised annihilation to the Xenos and the heretic. The bolts ceased 2 meters from the shard surface. Not deflected, not detonated, they simply stopped being. Their matter edited from the cosmic ledger as if they'd never been forged, never been blessed, never been fired. "Melter weapons!" the sergeant roared, dropping his bolt gun and drawing a multi-melter from his back mount. 2 more Space Marines did the same, swinging the massive weapons to bear, targeting arrays painting the shard with a dozen lock-on runes. The melter beams hit simultaneously. Superheated air turned to plasma, temperature spiking to levels that could vaporize tank armor in seconds. The beams struck the shard, and it ate them. The thermal energy poured into the entity like water into sand, absorbed and processed and converted into whatever sustained a god-fragment's existence. The shard's form stabilized further, its surface taking on a more metallic appearance, almost as if the melt-heat was helping it remember what physical form felt like. "It's feeding on our weapons," Librarian Zareth shouted unnecessarily. "Any energy-based attack only makes it stronger. We need—" The shard struck. Its arm, if that crystalline fractal appendage could be called an arm, extended across the transit station in defiance of distance and reached for the nearest Space Marine. Brother Corvus, his armor painted with battle honors from 17 campaigns, raised his combat shield instinctively. The shield was blessed adamantium, 3 inches thick, inscribed with prayers to the Emperor and the Omnissiah if both. It had turned aside power claws and demon blades and the claws of tyrannid warriors. It ceased. Brother Corvus barely had time to register the loss before the shard's touch found his helmet. For a fraction of a second, microseconds really, nothing happened. The Space Marine's enhanced physiology, his gene seed, his black carapace, all of it resisted in ways that unaugmented flesh couldn't. Then his eye lenses went dark. He fell. Not dead, worse, empty. A shell of ceramite and gene craft with nothing inside, as if the warrior who'd spent 2 centuries serving the Emperor had simply been deleted from reality, leaving only his armor behind as evidence he'd ever existed. "Fall back!" the sergeant commanded, but Space Marines didn't fall back easily. They were warriors bred for assault, for pushing forward into the teeth of horror and emerging victorious through faith and bolter fire. But they fell back now, because even demigods recognized futility when it reached through space and erased one of their brothers with a touch. The shard advanced, slow, patient. It had all the time in the universe. It had made the universe, or something like it, back when galaxies were songs and stars were food. Talric watched the Space Marines retreat in good order, providing covering fire that did nothing, maintaining formation even in the face of cosmic horror. Behind them, PDF soldiers were evacuating civilians, 40,000 people streaming toward emergency shelters, toward hab blocks with reinforced walls, toward any sanctuary that might protect them from something that made mockery of protection. Still with us in the darkness? Hit that like button if you're gripped by this tale of gods and men, of weapons that fail and courage that endures. Magos, the sergeant's voice crackled through the vox. Our weapons are ineffective. Our tactics are obsolete. We need options. Options. Talric's cogitators spun through 17 scenarios, each one ending in death and consumption. Energy weapons fed it. Kinetic weapons it simply erased. Psychic powers couldn't touch it. What remained? What could hurt something that exists outside the rules that govern reality? Then Vralix grabbed his arm, her burned fingers surprisingly strong. The tesseract labyrinth Dominus. It was caged once before. The Necrons imprisoned it using living metal and... Her eyes widened. Blackstone. Necron technology often incorporates blackstone, anti-psychic material that nullifies warp energy. But CTan aren't warp entities, they're anti-warp. What nullifies the warp might actually affect them because they exist in opposing states, Talric finished, his processors racing. Blackstone creates dead zones in the immaterium, areas where psychic power can't function. To something that exists entirely in materium, Blackstone might be... He paused, hope and horror mixing in equal measure. Toxic, disruptive, something it can't simply edit away because Blackstone predates even the CTan themselves. Do we have Blackstone? The sergeant demanded. Manufacturum 7 Alpha, 3 kilometers northeast. The facility processes archaeotech recovered from dead worlds. Last inventory showed 12 tons of Blackstone fragments awaiting analysis. 12 tons. Enough to build a prison. Enough to cage a god if they could survive long enough to use it. If being the operative word. The shard fed another PDF soldier. Then 2 more. Growing stronger with each soul, each spark of consciousness added to its vast hunger. And somewhere in the toxic sky above, Talric's sensors detected more Space Marine vessels entering orbit. The real battle was about to begin. The retreat through Arcturus Prime's industrial sectors was a masterclass in controlled chaos. Space Marines held choke points, while PDF soldiers herded civilians toward evacuation routes. Tech priests activated ancient defense turrets that hadn't fired in decades. Servitors formed living barricades, their lobotomized consciousnesses accepting sacrifice without complaint or comprehension. None of it mattered. The CTanShard moved through Arcturus Prime like a cancer through flesh, leaving void spheres in its wake. Perfectly circular absences where streets had been, where buildings had stood, where people had died, without even the dignity of corpses to mark their passing. It wasn't killing, it was erasing, editing the population from existence, one soul at a time. Talric rode in a Chimera APC commandeered from the PDF garrison, his cogitators linked to every sensor network still functioning in the affected sectors. His tactical overlay painted a picture of systematic devastation. 37 city blocks compromised, casualty estimates climbing past 2,000, and the Shard was accelerating, learning efficiency, discovering that it could feed on multiple souls simultaneously if they clustered together. The evacuation was herding people into optimal feeding clusters. "Disperse!" Talric's amplified voice boomed through every Vox speaker in range. "Don't group together! Scatter! Make yourselves difficult targets!" But panic didn't follow tactical logic. Civilians ran toward perceived safety, reinforced shelters, PDF checkpoints, anywhere that looked defended. They clustered by the hundreds, and the Shard followed the clusters like a predator following blood scent. Serena sat across from Talric in the Chimera's troop bay, her burns treated with counterseptic and synth skin by a PDF medic. She stared at her bandaged hands, silent, her eyes carrying the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much for a mind to properly contain. "Your sister," Talric said, his Vox grill softer than standard Mechanicus protocol allowed. "Maris. When this is over, you'll return to her. You'll tell her about today, and she'll understand why you survived, because someone had to remember, someone had to witness." What if there's nothing to witness? What if it eats everyone? What if Arcturus Prime becomes just empty? A planet with buildings but no people, like we never existed at all. Theta 19, who'd been checking his arc pistol for the 17th time, looked up. "Then the Imperium glasses the world from orbit and moves on. That's war in the 41st millennium, girl. Planets are expendable, people are expendable, but we fight anyway because surrender isn't in human nature. We're too stupid to know when we're beaten." "Is that supposed to be inspiring?" Serena asked. "It's supposed to be true. Inspiration is a luxury. Truth is survival." The Chimera's Vox crackled. Sergeant Marcellus of the Space Marines, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd faced extinction-level threats before. "Magos Talric, we've reached Manufactorum 7 Alpha. Blackstone deposit confirmed, but the facility is occupied. 3,000 workers on the evening shift. Evacuation in progress, but it will take time." Time they didn't have. Through the sensor networks, Talric watched the Shard carve a path through the industrial sectors, moving with terrible purpose toward the strongest concentrations of life. It had learned to sense souls now, to track consciousness the way a predator tracked heat signatures. And the Manufactorum, with 3,000 workers, would shine like a beacon. "Evacuate who you can," Talric said, "but prepare the Blackstone regardless. We need a containment solution before—" Every sensor in his network went dead simultaneously. Not malfunctioned, not damaged, dead. Their machine spirits fleeing from something that had just entered their detection range. Through the Chimera's viewport, Talric saw it. The eastern sky had developed a wrongness, a distortion that made his optical sensors stutter and crash. The CTanShard had taken flight. Not physically. It hadn't sprouted wings or activated anti-gravity systems. It had simply decided that down was no longer relevant and begun moving through three-dimensional space as if it were two-dimensional, compressing distance by folding reality like origami. It was heading toward Manufactorum 7 Alpha, toward 3,000 souls and the one substance on Arcturus Prime that might actually hurt it. "Faster!" Talric commanded the Chimera's driver. "Emergency speed! Disregard safety protocols!" The APC's engine roared, promethium injectors flooding the combustion chambers with fuel. They shot through the industrial sectors at speeds that made the vehicle's frame shudder, past manufactorums and hab blocks and PDF checkpoints where soldiers stared at the sky with the expression of people who just realized their weapons were irrelevant. Librarian Zareth's voice cut through the Vox network, strained with effort. I am attempting to mask the Manufactorum's prescientiac presence, to hide the concentration of souls. But CTan don't perceive through the warp. They sense through the absence of warp, through the weight of consciousness in materium. I can't hide what exists in a realm they understand better than we do. Then we need bait, Sergeant Marcellus said. Something to draw it away long enough to— I volunteer, interrupted Brother Thalric, one of the space marines who'd survived the transit engagement. A single Astartes, isolated and exposed. It will sense the genetic enhancement, the gene seed, a richer meal than unaugmented humans. I can buy 10 minutes before— You'll buy 3 seconds before your armor becomes your tomb, Zareth interrupted. We've already lost Brother Corvus. I won't authorize suicide missions that achieve nothing. Then what do we do? The question came from a PDF colonel, his voice cracking with desperation. We can't fight it. We can't hide from it. We can't even slow it down. So what do we do? Silence on the Vox network. 3 seconds of dead air that felt like centuries, filled only by the Chimera's roaring engine and the distant sound of void spheres expanding through Arcturus Prime. Then Vralik spoke, her voice steady despite the burns and the exhaustion and the horror. We cage it, not with walls, but with physics. Blackstone disrupts warp energy, yes, but it also affects the fundamental forces of the universe. It creates zones of normalcy, where reality refuses to be edited because the Blackstone anchors it in place.
A tesseract labyrinth, Talric breathed, understanding crystallizing in his processors. The Necrons didn't just trap the CTan in containers. They created pocket dimensions where the laws of physics were so rigidly enforced that even god-fragments couldn't violate them. Mathematical prisons where 2 + 2 always equaled 4, and space-time refused to be negotiated with. Can we build one? Marcellus demanded. No, Talric admitted. Necron technology is millions of years beyond our understanding, but we can create a zone, a black stone perimeter with enough concentration to anchor reality, to make it difficult for the Shard to edit. Not impossible, just difficult. Slow it down, give it resistance. And then, Theta 19 asked. Then we improvise, Marcellus said grimly. Astartes excel at improvisation, usually involves high explosives and faith in the Emperor's providence, but we'll adapt. The Chimera screamed around a corner, its suspension groaning. Manufactorum 7 Alpha loomed ahead, a massive structure 20 stories tall, its walls covered in cooling vents and exhaust ports, its interior housing the Archaeotech processing facilities, where Arcturus Prime examined artifacts recovered from dead civilizations, where 12 tons of Blackstone waited to become either salvation or a particularly exotic tombstone. Space Marines formed a perimeter around the facility, their bronze armor standing out against the industrial gray. PDF soldiers manned barricades that wouldn't stop the Shard, but made them feel useful. And from the emergency exits, workers poured out in organized panic, guided by Skitari Rangers who understood that every second mattered. Talric's Chimera skidded to a halt at the perimeter. He emerged, his damaged augments protesting, and found Sergeant Marcellus waiting.
2,000 evacuated. 1,000 remain inside, primarily menials from the deep processing levels. The black stone is stored in sub-level tertius, shielded vaults that... He paused, his helmet tilting slightly. Contact. Eastern approach. Distance 4 kilometers and closing. 4 kilometers. At the speed the shard was moving, that meant less than 5 minutes. "Get me to the black stone," Talric said. "I need to assess the deposits, calculate dispersal patterns, determine optimal configuration for a containment field." "And if your calculations are wrong?" Marcellus asked. Talric looked up at the toxic orange sky, at the distortion that marked the shard's approach, at the wrongness spreading through reality like ink through water. "Then we die," he said simply, "but we die trying. The Omnissiah asks nothing more from his servants." Marcellus nodded, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. "The Emperor protects, Magos, and the Omnissiah provides. Let us hope they're both paying attention today." They entered Manufactorum 7 Alpha at a run, descending into its depths where ancient stones older than human civilization waited to face a god that predated stones themselves. Behind them, the eastern sky began to crack. Sub-level tertius of Manufactorum 7 Alpha smelled of ozone and antiquity. The blackstone deposits were housed in shielded vaults, each one lined with lead and blessed ceramite to contain the strange radiations that all archaeotech produced. Emergency lumens cast everything in red, turning the corridor into something that resembled the interior of a beating heart. Talric's mechalodendrites interfaced with the vault controls, authorization code streaming through his consciousness. The massive doors ground open, revealing 12 tons of blackstone fragments arranged on analysis tables, chunks of matte black material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, that made his sensors malfunction just by proximity. "This is it?" Marcellus asked, his helmet's auspex array scanning the deposits. "This is what caged gods?" "Components of what caged gods," Talric corrected, his optical sensors cycling through 17 different spectra as he examined the fragments. "Blackstone is complicated. It exists partially in real space and partially in the warp, creating zones of null space where both are suppressed. To CTan, beings of pure materium, concentrated blackstone should be..." He paused, processing. "Toxic isn't the right word. Disruptive. It disrupts their ability to edit physics because it enforces physical laws at a fundamental level." Vralex moved among the fragments, her damaged hands running scanners over each piece. "Density analysis shows these are high-grade specimens. Properly configured, we could create a suppression field approximately 50 meters in radius. Anything inside that field would be subject to enforced physical constants, gravity, thermodynamics, conservation of mass and energy, all of it locked in place." "The shard is 9 meters tall," Theta-19 observed. "Will 50 meters be enough?" "It will have to be," Talric said, his processors calculating dispersal patterns, optimal placement coordinates, power requirements for the field generators they'd need to activate the blackstone properly. "We'll configure the fragments in hexagonal pattern, 6 primary nodes with smaller fragments filling the gaps. When activated, they'll create an overlapping null space that..." The Manufactorum shuddered. Not a physical impact, something worse, a vibration that came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the building itself was suddenly uncertain about its own structural integrity. Dust rained from the ceiling, ancient machinery groaned, and through the noosphere, Talric felt machine spirits throughout the facility beginning to panic, their simple consciousnesses recoiling from something that made mockery of everything they understood about how reality functioned. "It's here," Librarian Zareth's voice crackled through the vox, tight with strain. "Ground level. It's Emperor's teeth. It's learning. It's studying the facility, analyzing it, looking for the most efficient way to—" A scream cut through the Vox network, then another, then 17 more in rapid succession, overlapping into a chorus of terror that even Talric's emotional dampers struggled to filter the horror. The Shard had found the workers still evacuating from the deep processing levels. 1,000 menials clustered in the eastern stairwells, making for the emergency exits. 1,000 souls packed together like cattle in a pen. It fed. Through the facility's remaining sensor network, Talric watched the casualty counters spike. 1,000 became 900, 800, 700. The numbers dropped like stones, each digit representing a human consciousness that had existed for decades, had loved and feared and hoped, and now simply didn't. "Move!" Marcellus roared, and his space marines snapped into action with the precision of warriors who drilled for 10,000 scenarios. They grabbed Blackstone fragments, their power armor servo motors straining under the weight. Each chunk was 50 kilograms minimum, dense beyond normal matter, heavy with the weight of enforced reality. Talric mechanodendrites wrapped around 3 fragments simultaneously, magnetic clamps engaging. His augmented frame could handle the load, but barely. "Main processing floor. We set the perimeter there. It's the largest open space, gives us room to maneuver." They ran, space marines carrying fragments that would have crushed unaugmented humans, tech priests straining their augments to the breaking point, PDF soldiers forming a protective escort that knew their weapons were useless but marched anyway because duty demanded it. The main processing floor was a cathedral of industry, 30 meters high, 100 meters across, lined with assembly stations and sorting conveyors. Catwalks crisscrossed overhead, cargo lifters stood silent and rusting. And in the center, a clear space where archaeotech specimens were examined before being sorted into their respective categories. "Hexagonal pattern," Talric commanded, his tactical overlay projecting the optimal configuration into the noosphere, where every tech priest could see it. "Primary nodes at 15-meter spacing. Vralex, you handle power distribution. I'll configure the resonance matrices." They worked with desperate efficiency, placing fragments according to calculations that would either save them or merely ensure they died in an interesting geometric pattern. Above them, the ceiling began to develop holes, not structural damage, ontological damage. The CTanShard was coming through the upper levels, not walking through doors or smashing through walls, just transitioning from one floor to the next by editing out the concept of floor entirely. 500 workers dead, 400, 300. "How long to activate?" Marcellus demanded, his bolt gun tracking the ceiling, watching void spheres blossom like fatal flowers. 2 minutes! Talric's mechadendrites flew across the central fragment, inscribing activation runes with a laser scribe, calling on secret geometries that the Mechanicus had preserved from the dark age of technology. The fragments need to be synchronized, their resonance frequencies aligned, or they'll just be inert rocks that happen to disrupt sensor readings. 100 workers remaining. 50. 20. The shard dropped through the ceiling. Not fell, manifested, reality folding to accommodate its impossible form. It stood in the processing floor 30 meters from their position, 9 meters of crystalline horror and geometric hatred, its form stabilized now into something almost solid, almost comprehensible. It had fed well, consumed over 3,000 souls since its awakening. It was remembering what it had been before the Necron shattered it and locked the fragments away. It was remembering when it had walked among stars as a god and drunk their light like wine. And it saw the Blackstone. For the first time since its awakening, the CTanShard hesitated. Its form flickered, cycling through configurations as it analyzed the fragments, recognized them as Necron construction, remembered, if memory was the right word, what these materials had done to it eons ago. 1 minute, Talric gasped, his processors overheating from the calculation load. Marcellus, buy us time! With what? The Space Marine sergeant asked, but he was already moving, his squad forming a firing line between the Shard and the Blackstone perimeter. All units, concentrated fire, aim for center mass, make it look at us instead of them. 10 bolt guns roared. Mass reactive rounds screamed across the processing floor, detonating uselessly as they ceased to exist 2 meters from the Shard's surface. But the noise was impressive, the fury was real, and for a handful of seconds the entity's attention shifted from the Blackstone fragments to the Space Marines who dared challenge it. It struck at Brother Talric, the warrior who'd volunteered for bait duty earlier. The Space Marine met the attack with his combat blade, a master-crafted power weapon that had killed Chaos Champions and Orc Knobs and warriors who'd forgotten more about combat than most humans would ever learn. The blade touched the Shard's surface and simply stopped being. The molecular disruption field, the power cells, the consecrated metal, all of it edited from existence. Brother Talric found himself holding a grip attached to nothing, staring at the absence where his weapon had been. Then the Shard's crystalline appendage reached for his helmet. Librarian Zareth moved. Not teleportation. Space Marines couldn't teleport without dedicated equipment, but enhanced reflexes pushed to their absolute limit. Gene seed and training and psychic foresight combining to let him cross 5 meters in less than a second. He grabbed Brother Talric and pulled, hauling him backward just as the Shard's touch passed through the space where his helmet had been. 30 seconds! Rollick shouted, her fingers bleeding as she made final connections in the power distribution network. Talric, I need confirmation on resonance frequency. The calculations were impossible. 6 variables, 17 constraints, mathematics that predated the Mechanicus and possibly predated humanity itself. Talric's cagitators ran the numbers, crashed, reran them, produced 17 different solutions that might work or turn the Blackstone into inert decoration. He chose one, not the safest, not the one with highest probability of success, but the one that felt right, that aligned with sacred geometries he'd studied for 2 centuries, that resonated with something deeper than logic. Frequency 793.44, he transmitted. Activate on my mark. The CTanShard swept its arm in a wide arc, and half the firing line ceased. 4 Space Marines, warriors who'd survived decades of the galaxy's worst horrors, simply stopped existing. Their armor clattered to the ground, empty shells that would be recovered later so their gene seed could be harvested and implanted in new aspirants, if there was a later. Marcellus grabbed a melt-a-bomb from his belt, primed it, and threw.
The explosive struck the shard's torso and detonated. Not an attack, but a distraction. Superheated plasma washing over the entity's surface, forcing it to process energy instead of erasing space marines. "Now!" Talric roared, and 6 tech priests simultaneously activated their fragments. The black stone sang. Not sound, resonance, a vibration that existed at the quantum level, at the level where matter decided what it wanted to be and reality negotiated the terms. The 6 primary nodes began to glow, not with light, but with unlight, with an absence that somehow shone brighter than any lumen. The hexagonal perimeter formed, 50 meters of enforced reality, of space where physics had teeth and wouldn't be negotiated with, where 2 + 2 = 4, and anyone who disagreed could take it up with the fundamental constants of the universe. The CTanShard stood at the perimeter's edge, one appendage extended into the field, and for the first time since its awakening, it felt pain.
Pain was an alien concept to a CTan. They were beings of pure energy and will, entities that had existed since the universe was young and hot, that had fed on stars and shaped reality according to their desires. Pain required vulnerability. Pain required the possibility of harm. The Blackstone field made harm possible. The shard's appendage, the crystalline pseudopod that had erased 4 space marines from existence, began to solidify where it touched the field boundary. Not metaphorically, literally. Its constantly shifting quantum state locked into a single configuration, matter deciding it was matter and refusing to be anything else. The shard shrieked. Not sound, something worse, a discharge of frustrated will that rippled through the electromagnetic spectrum, that made every piece of electronic equipment in the manufactorum stutter and fail, that sent feedback screaming through Talric's nospheric connection hard enough to crash 3 of his cognitive processes. It withdrew the appendage. Where the Blackstone field had touched it, the crystalline surface showed something unprecedented. Damage, microfractures spiderwebbed across its form, imperfections in geometry that had been mathematically perfect moments before. "It's working," Relix whispered, her voice carrying equal parts awe and terror. The field is forcing it to obey physical laws. It can't edit matter inside the perimeter. It has to interact with it, like we do, like anything bound by thermodynamics and conservation of energy. "Then we need it inside the perimeter," Marcellus said. His remaining squad, 6 space marines now, 6 out of 10 who'd entered this manufactorum, holding defensive positions around the Blackstone nodes. "How do we force a god into a cage it doesn't want to enter?" The CTanShard circled the perimeter, studying it with senses that extended beyond human comprehension. Talric watched it through the facility's remaining sensors, watched it test the field at different points, different angles, probing for weaknesses the way a predator tested prey for signs of injury. It found none. The hexagonal configuration was holding, 6 nodes maintaining overlapping fields of enforced reality that created a zone where even a god-fragment had to obey the same rules as mortal flesh. But the shard wasn't trapped. It was excluded, standing outside the cage while its food cowered inside. And it was learning, always learning, adapting to every obstacle humanity threw at it. "It's going to destroy the nodes," Theta 19 observed, his arc pistol trained on the nearest fragment. "One by one, it'll erase them from outside the field, and when the perimeter collapses..." The shard struck at the nearest node. Its appendage lashed out, that reality-editing touch reaching for the Blackstone fragment.
The stone resisted. Where normal matter would have simply ceased, the black stone fought, its quantum structure refusing to be negotiated with, its fundamental nature as a reality anchor, making it resistant to the same editing that had erased Wasteel and Ceramite. But resistant wasn't immune. The fragment began to thin, atom by atom, its mass slowly decreasing as the shard applied focused will against matter that was designed to resist will. It was like watching ice melt in reverse, solid becoming less solid, becoming suggestion, becoming memory. "Defend the nodes," Marcellus commanded, and his space marines opened fire. Not at the shard, that was futile, but at the space between the entity and the fragments, filling the air with explosive death that forced the shard to process incoming energy, to divide its attention between destroying the cage and consuming the attacks. Talric's processors raced through scenarios. The shard would destroy the perimeter eventually. 5 minutes, maybe 10 if the Space Marines kept it distracted. They needed a permanent solution. They needed... "Bait," he said aloud. "It's here because it's hungry, because it senses 300 souls inside this facility and wants to feed. So we give it something it can't resist, something so rich, so concentrated, that it stops trying to dismantle the cage and enters willingly." "What could possibly be more tempting than 300 souls?" Ralix asked. Talric turned to Librarian Zareth. The Psyker stood at the perimeter's edge, his eyes still glowing with psychic power, his presence radiating the warp-touched energy that came from decades of channeling the Immaterium's fury. "You," Talric said. "CTan feed on souls, on consciousness, on the energy that animates living matter. But Psykers are concentrated consciousness, souls so bright they touch the warp itself. To something that feeds on life force, a librarian would be..." He paused, horrified by his own logic. "Irresistible." Zareth's glowing eyes met Talric's optical sensors. For a moment neither spoke. Then the librarian nodded slowly. "I understand, and I volunteer, not as bait to be consumed, as bait to draw it into the cage. Once it's inside, once it's bound by physical laws, perhaps we can contain it, restrain it long enough for reinforcements to arrive with proper containment equipment." "It will kill you," Marcellus said flatly, "the moment it touches you. Then I ensure it touches me inside the perimeter, where its ability to unmake matter is suppressed, where it has to fight me the way any Xenos would fight, with physical force, with energy, with violence that follows rules." He smiled grimly behind his helmet. "I've killed daemons in psychic duels, beings of pure warp stuff that could reshape reality with a thought. A CTan in a suppression field is almost conventional by comparison." "Almost," Teta 19 muttered. Key word being almost. But there was no time for debate. The fragment was half its original mass now, atoms fleeing from the shard's attention. When it failed, the hexagonal perimeter would collapse to a pentagon, and the field strength would drop by 30%. Then another node would fail, then another, mathematics and entropy conspiring toward inevitable defeat. Zareth walked to the perimeter center. His power armor's servomotors hummed as he drew his force sword, a blade that channeled psychic energy into matter-disrupting fury, that could cleave through tank armor and daemon flesh with equal ease. Inside the Blackstone field, it would just be a sword, sharp, well-made, but conventional. He raised it in salute to the CTanShard, a gesture of challenge that transcended species and epochs, warrior to warrior, predator to prey. "Come and take what you hunger for."
The Shard stopped its assault on the fragment. Its attention, that crushing, terrible focus, shifted to Zareth, to the bright soul standing in the open, practically radiating psychic potential, a meal rich enough to make 300 menials seem like appetizers. It wanted him. Talric saw the hunger in the entity's form, saw it flicker and pulse with anticipation. This was food worthy of a god. This was consciousness concentrated enough to be satisfying. The Shard entered the perimeter. Reality locked around it like a vice, its form solidified instantly, quantum states collapsing into single configurations, matter becoming just matter instead of negotiable suggestion. It stood 8 meters inside the field boundary, still 9 meters tall, still impossibly dangerous, but bound now by the same laws that govern stars and stones and space marines. Zareth struck. His force sword blazed with psychic fire as it descended. Inside the suppression field, his powers were muted but not eliminated. The Blackstone restricting warp energy, but unable to completely negate a trained librarian's will. The blade struck the Shard's torso and bit. Not deep. A scratch, really, measured in millimeters. But it was damage. Actual physical damage inflicted on a being that hadn't felt a wound in 60 million years. The Shard shrieked, nearly collapsed the manufactorum. Windows shattered. Machinery exploded. 3 PDF soldiers outside the perimeter simply died, their nervous systems overloaded by the psychic feedback. Then it struck back. Its appendage lashed out, solid now, bound by mass and momentum, moving at speeds that physics actually allowed. Zareth blocked with his sword, ceramite and psychic will meeting crystalline fury. The impact drove him backward 3 meters, his boots leaving gouges in the rockcrete floor. "Now!" Marcellus roared, and his space marines charged into the perimeter, bolt guns abandoned in favor of combat blades and power fists, weapons that could affect matter even when matter refused to stop being matter. The battle became primordial. No reality editing, no quantum manipulation, just warriors and a caged god trading blows that followed actual physical laws. Brother Thalric's power fist connected with the Shard's lower segment, ceramite and adamantium crushing crystalline structure. The entity's appendage swept through Brother Kestrel's helmet, but instead of erasing him from existence, it simply crushed his head through conventional blunt force trauma. He died. But he died in a way that made sense. His body remained, his gene seed recoverable. Zareth zooled the Shard in the perimeter center, his force sword leaving hairline fractures with each strike, psychic fire battling god-forged matter. He was bleeding. The Shard's attack still carried devastating force, still crushed ceramite and broke bones. But he was fighting, giving ground slowly, making the entity work for every meter. "Thalric!" Vralik shouted over the sounds of combat. "The field is destabilizing. The Shard's presence inside the perimeter is creating resonance interference. We have maybe 3 minutes before—" A massive impact shook the manufactorum. Through the facility's remaining external sensors, Thalric detected multiple heat signatures descending from orbit, large ones, capital ship grade. Reinforcements had arrived. Through the Vox network, a new voice spoke, deep, authoritative, carrying the weight of centuries. "This is Captain Mordrin of the Brazen Minotaurs, 3rd Company. We have received distress signals regarding CTan manifestation. All ground forces, mark your positions. We are deploying containment assets." "Containment assets," Marcellus grunted, dodging a strusk that would have decapitated him. "What containment assets?" Stasis bombs, Talric breathed, accessing our Startaze tactical databases through his Mechanicus clearances. Weapons designed to create temporal stasis fields. If they can freeze the shard in a moment of time. Clear the perimeter, Captain Mordrin's voice cut through every Vox channel. All personnel evacuate to minimum safe distance of 500 meters. Stasis bombardment in 90 seconds. 90 seconds. Zareth was bleeding from 17 wounds, his force sword chipped and cracked, his psychic reserves depleted. The shard loomed over him, its form damaged but regenerating, microfractures sealing as it learned to repair itself even within the suppression field. Librarian, move! Marcellus grabbed Zareth and pulled, hauling him toward the perimeter edge. The remaining Space Marines followed, their retreat covered by concentrated bolter fire that actually worked now. Mass reactive rounds chipping away at crystalline structure that physics forced to be solid. They crossed the field boundary. The Blackstone perimeter would hold, barely, trapping the shard inside until the stasis bombs arrived. The CTanShard stood in the center of the cage, surrounded by the bodies of workers it had fed on, standing over Brother Kestrel's corpse, its form flickering as it tried and failed to return to its quantum state. It looked at Talric through the perimeter, met its optical sensors with those geometric voids that served as eyes. And in that moment, across species and epochs and fundamental differences in existence, Talric felt something pass between them. Not communication, not understanding, but acknowledgement. Predator recognizing the prey that had, against all odds, built a cage strong enough to hold it. Then the sky opened, and thunder descended. The stasis bombs fell like the Emperor's judgment made manifest. They weren't conventional ordnance, no explosions, no fire, no kinetic devastation. They were temporal weapons, ancient archaeotech that the Mechanicus had reverse-engineered from pre-imperial designs. Technology that some whispered came from the Dark Age, when humanity had challenged the stars themselves. Talric watched through the facility's external sensors as 12 projectiles descended from orbit, their trajectories calculated to microsecond precision by cogitators aboard the Brazen Minotaur's strike cruiser. Each bomb was 3 meters long, its surface covered in chronometric symbols and reality-anchoring runes that made his processors ache just processing the visual data. They impacted in a perfect hexagonal pattern around Manufactorum's 7 Alpha. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Reality froze, not metaphorically, literally froze. Time itself locked into a single eternal moment within the designated containment zone. Dust particles hung motionless in the air. Flames from burning machinery stopped flickering, became sculptures of light. And inside the Blackstone perimeter, the CTanShard became a statue of crystalline horror, locked mid-strike, its appendage raised to deliver a blow that would never land. But temporal stasis was imperfect. Talric's sensors detected fluctuations in the field, moments where time stuttered forward a microsecond before locking again. The shard was fighting the stasis, its will pressing against technology designed to cage it, reality and counter-reality grinding against each other like tectonic plates. Field stability at 73%, reported a tech priest from the Brazen Minotaur's vessel, his voice crackling through the Vox network. Temporal lock holding, but the entity is generating significant resistance. Estimated containment duration, 6 hours before catastrophic field collapse. 6 hours.
Talric's processors translated that into actionable intelligence. 6 hours to evacuate Arcturus Prime's population, to move 3 million souls off-world before the shard broke free and began feeding in earnest. 6 hours to decide whether this world could be saved or whether it needed to burn from orbit to deny the CTan its feast. "All personnel, withdraw to secondary perimeter," Captain Mordrin commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an Astartes officer who'd fought in campaigns across 3 sectors. "Magos Talric, I require immediate consultation regarding long-term containment options." Talric limped toward the evacuation staging area, his damaged augments protesting every movement. Vralek supported him, her own injuries temporarily forgotten in the adrenaline crash that followed survival. Serena walked between 2 PDF soldiers, her eyes distant, her mind processing horrors that would fuel nightmares for whatever remained of her life. Theta 19 carried Brother Kestrel's body, the Space Marine's empty armor cradled with the reverence that the Skitarii reserved for sacred relics. His gene seed would be harvested, implanted in a new aspirant, continuing the cycle that had sustained the Space Marines for 10,000 years. Death was never the end for the Emperor's chosen, merely a transition to a new vessel. The staging area was organized chaos, PDF regiments establishing defensive positions, tech priests erecting sensor arrays to monitor the stasis field, Medicae stations treating the wounded, burns, radiation poisoning, psychological trauma that no amount of counterseptic could heal. And above it all, Space Marines in bronze armor standing watch, bolt guns ready, eyes scanning for threats that conventional soldiers would never see. Captain Mordrin was exactly what Talric expected from an Astartes company commander. 2.5 meters of gene-enhanced violence wrapped in masterwork armor, his face a roadmap of scars earned across centuries of warfare. His eyes, augmented, enhanced, but still fundamentally human, fixed on Talric with the intensity of a man who'd seen his brothers die today and wanted answers. "Magos Dominus," Mordrin's voice was granite grinding against steel. "My chapter has fought CTanShards twice before. Both times required orbital bombardment and the sacrifice of entire companies. Both times we succeeded only because the shards were newly awakened, disoriented, weak from starvation." He gestured toward the frozen manufactorium. "That thing has fed on over 3,000 souls. It's adapted to our weapons, learned to manipulate our technology, grown stronger with each passing minute. Tell me honestly, can it be contained?" Talric's processors ran calculations, scenarios, probability matrices. None of them produced encouraging results. "Short-term, yes. The Blackstone perimeter combined with temporal stasis creates a dual-layer containment that even a CTan fragment will struggle to breach. Long-term..." I paused, his Vox grill crackling with static that might have been hesitation. "Long-term containment requires Necron-level technology. Tesseract labyrinths, pocket dimensions, mathematics that humanity lost millions of years before we ever existed. We can cage it for hours, perhaps days, but eventually it breaks free and continues feeding," Mordrin finished, "and by then it will be strong enough that even orbital bombardment might prove insufficient."
The implication hung in the toxic air between them. There was one certain solution to a CTan manifestation: exterminatus, virus bombing, cyclonic torpedoes, weapons that would scour Arcturus Prime clean of life, denying the Shard its food source and starving it back into dormancy. 3 million souls, an entire Furge world's population, the industrial output that sustained 17 guard regiments, all of it expendable when weighed against the possibility of a star god breaking free. "There has to be another way," Vralik said, her voice small but defiant. "We built the containment field. We forced it to obey physical laws. If we can strengthen the Blackstone perimeter, add more nodes, create overlapping suppression fields, we would need hundreds of tons of Blackstone. Arcturus Prime's entire archaeotech reserve is 12 tons. Acquiring more would require excavation missions to dead worlds, expeditions that could take months or years. We have 6 hours. Serena spoke up, her voice hoarse from screaming and smoke inhalation. "Then we have 6 hours to be clever. Isn't that what the Mechanicus does? Solve impossible problems with sacred technology and faith in the Omniscience?" She wasn't wrong. Talric had spent 2 centuries solving problems that lesser tech priests declared impossible. He'd repaired STC fragments that had been written off as corrupted beyond salvation. He'd activated machine spirits that had been dormant for millennia. He'd done the impossible because the Omniscience rewarded those who refused to accept defeat.
But he'd never caged a god before. "Captain," Talric said slowly, his processors assembling a plan from fragments of desperate logic. "The Shard is contained within a temporal stasis field. Time inside the field is essentially frozen, which means the entity's internal processes, its thoughts, its will, its ability to generate reality-editing effects are also frozen, correct?" "That's the theory," Mordrin confirmed, "though temporal mechanics are imprecise. The field doesn't stop time completely. It slows it to a near halt. For every hour we experience, the Shard experiences perhaps a microsecond." "Then we have more time than we thought," Talric said, his excitement building despite the exhaustion and trauma. "Not 6 hours to evacuate, 6 hours to build, to construct a permanent containment solution using the temporal differential as our ally. If the Shard experiences time 1,000,000 times slower than we do, then 6 hours gives us the equivalent of—" His processors calculated furiously. "Centuries. From its perspective, centuries to build a cage before it can react." Librarian Zareth, his wounds hastily treated with counterseptic and battlefield surgery, limped closer. "You're suggesting we construct a containment facility around it while it's frozen in stasis?" "Not a facility," Talric corrected. "A prison. We use the existing Blackstone perimeter as a foundation. Add structural reinforcement, void-hardened ceramite, blessed adamantium, every material we have that's proven resistant to reality manipulation. We embed additional Blackstone fragments in the walls, the floor, the ceiling, creating a 3-dimensional suppression matrix, and we power it with Arcturus Prime's entire geothermal network, unlimited energy to maintain the field indefinitely. Or until the Mechanicus can retrieve proper Necron containment technology," Vralix added, understanding dawning in her eyes. "This wouldn't be permanent. It would be a holding solution, something to keep it caged until we can study it, understand it, perhaps even learn to destroy it properly." Mordrin was silent for a long moment, his enhanced mind processing the implications. "You're proposing we turn Manufactorum 7 Alpha into a prison specifically designed to hold a CTanShard.
a permanent facility that would require constant monitoring, endless resources, eternal vigilance. Yes, Talric said simply. And if your containment fails, if the shard adapts, learns to bypass the suppression fields, then we evacuate and glass the site from orbit, Talric replied. But if we don't try, if we simply give up and declare exterminatus now, we lose everything. The Forge world, the population, the knowledge we could gain from studying a CTan in captivity. We lose the chance to learn how to fight these things better, to develop weapons and tactics that might save millions of lives when the next Shard awakens. Because there would be a next Shard. The galaxy was littered with Necron tomb worlds, with tesseract labyrinths buried beneath dead civilizations, with fragments of shattered gods waiting to be accidentally unleashed by curious excavation teams who didn't know what they had found until it was too late. This wasn't just about Arcturus Prime. This was about preparing humanity for threats that the Imperium barely understood, for wars against enemies that predated the species itself. Captain Mordrin looked towards the frozen manufactorum, towards the crystalline horror locked in temporal stasis, towards the entity that had killed 4 of his brothers and 3,000 Imperial citizens. Then he activated his Vox link to the strike cruiser in orbit. Bridge, this is Mordrin. Initiate Protocol Bastion. I want every tech priest, every servitor, every kilogram of blessed material we have planetside within the hour. We're building a prison. A pause. Then from the ship. Confirmed, Captain. The Emperor protects. And the Omniscia provides, Talric whispered, already beginning calculations for the most important construction project of his 2-century career. They had 6 hours. They would need every second. The construction of what would later be designated Containment Facility Xerxes Prime was a miracle of desperate engineering and faith made manifest. Within the first hour, 17 heavy lifters descended from orbit, carrying prefabricated void shield generators, blessed ceramite plating, and adamantium structural beams that had been requisitioned from the brazen Minotaur's own vessel stores. Tech priests swarmed the frozen manufactorum like insects around a corpse, each one linked through the noosphere into a single unified consciousness dedicated to one purpose: cage the god. Talric directed the construction from a mobile command center, a Chimera APC converted into a rolling cogitator bank, its interior packed with hololithic displays showing real-time sensor data from 17 different angles. Through his noospheric connection, he experienced the construction through 100 different perspectives simultaneously. Servitors welding adamantium beams, tech priests calibrating void shield harmonics, Skitarii rangers maintaining security perimeter, space marines standing eternal watch. The temporal stasis field created surreal construction conditions. Workers could approach within meters of the frozen CTanShard, could literally walk around the entity that had killed thousands, could examine its crystalline structure up close without fear of immediate death. But the stasis field's edges created distortion. Step too close, and time began to slow, movements becoming sluggish, thoughts stretching like taffy. 3 workers crossed too far into the field's influence zone. They didn't die, but they became trapped, their bodies frozen in time along with the shard, conscious but unable to move, experiencing subjective eternity in a single objective second. Talric authorized their inclusion in the containment structure's foundation. They would remain there, frozen, until the stasis field eventually failed. Decades or centuries from now, long after everyone involved in this crisis had died and been forgotten. It was a terrible mercy, but mercy nonetheless.
By hour 2, the basic structure was complete, a dome of ceramite and adamantium rising 40 meters high, its walls 3 meters thick, every surface inscribed with prayers to the Omnisia and warnings in 17 languages, including extinct dialects that predated the Imperium. The dome completely enclosed the black stone perimeter and the frozen CTanShard, creating a physical barrier that supplemented the temporal and reality suppression fields. Void shield generators online, reported Tech Priest Horvald, his voice distorted by the 14-hour shift he'd been working without rest. Generating overlapping defensive envelopes. Even if the temporal stasis fails, the void shield should absorb initial reality manipulation attempts. Should, Theta 19 muttered from his position guarding the command center. Impressive how often that word appears when discussing caging gods. He wasn't wrong. Every calculation Talric ran came with enormous error margins, probability curves that admitted they were extrapolating from insufficient data. Humanity had faced CTanShards before, but never studied one in detail, never attempted long-term containment. Every decision was educated guesswork backed by prayer and desperation. By hour 3, additional blackstone fragments had arrived. Not tons, but kilograms, precious specimens transported from 3 neighboring forge worlds at speeds that would have been impossible without Astartes' authority overriding standard Mechanicus protocols. Each fragment was embedded in the containment dome structure, creating a 3-dimensional suppression matrix that Vralex calculated would maintain a reality-anchoring field approximately 70% as strong as the Necron tesseract labyrinths. 70% against a god-fragment that was already adapting, already learning. It would have to be enough. Librarian Zareth, despite his injuries, insisted on participating in the construction. He walked the containment dome's interior, his psychic senses extended, probing for weaknesses in the suppression matrix. His force sword hung at his side, its blade still chipped from combat with the Shard, a physical reminder that even gods could be wounded when forced to fight on mortal terms. "There's a resonance," he reported, his voice tight with concentration, "between the black stone and the stasis field. They're harmonizing somehow, creating interference patterns that might actually strengthen the containment. If we could calibrate the temporal generators to match the black stone's quantum frequency." "Already in progress," Talric replied, his mechadendrites interfacing with the calibration cogitators. Sacred mathematics scrolled through his consciousness, equations that balanced temporal mechanics against reality suppression against thermodynamic constraints. The numbers were beautiful in their complexity, elegant in their precision, if they worked. By hour 4, Captain Mordrin established permanent garrison protocols. 1 squad of Space Marines would maintain watch over the containment facility at all times, rotating every 6 months, their duties considered a sacred vigil rather than a punishment posting. Skitari regiments would provide secondary security. Tech priests would monitor the suppression fields every hour, checking for degradation or adaptation. And every decade, if the containment held, the Mechanicus would attempt to study the Shard further, to understand what it was, what it wanted, how it could be destroyed if containment ever failed catastrophically. "This is temporary," Mordrin reminded Talric as they watched servitors weld the final sections of the dome's exterior plating. "You understand that, yes. Eventually, a century from now, a millennium, this containment will fail. All cages fail eventually, and when it does, When it does, we'll be better prepared. We'll have weapons designed specifically for CTan engagement, tactics refined through study, knowledge that might save billions of lives across the Imperium. This isn't just a prison, it's a laboratory, a chance to understand enemies that most of the Imperium still considers myth. Serena approached the command center, her burns treated properly now, and her face showing the permanent changes that trauma etched into human features. She'd been helping with the evacuation coordination, using her knowledge of Arcturus Prime's hab-block layouts to guide civilians toward transport ships. My sister sent a Vox message. She knows I'm alive. I'm going to see her when this is done. Tell her about everything that happened here. She paused, looking toward the containment dome where a god-fragment is frozen in eternal rage. What do I tell her? How do I explain that we found something that shouldn't exist, woke it up, and then somehow managed to cage it again? Tell her the truth. That humanity survives not because we're strong, but because we're stubborn. Because when we find horrors that should kill us, we study them instead. Because we build cages for gods and call it progress.
By hour 5, the geothermal power connection was complete. Arcturus Prime's planetary core, deliberately cracked centuries ago to provide industrial power, now fed its endless heat into the containment facility's generators. The energy requirements were astronomical, enough to power a small city, but the Forge World's output could sustain it indefinitely. The dome's exterior was complete now, a perfect half-sphere of adamantium and faith, rising from the manufactorium district like a cathedral to human arrogance. Warning klaxons had been mounted at 50-meter intervals, ready to sound if containment began failing. Auspex arrays monitored every frequency, watching for changes in the shard's quantum signature. And inside, frozen in the moment of its defeat, the CTanShard waited with the patience of something that had existed for epochs and would exist for epochs more. By hour 6, Captain Mordrin gathered everyone who'd survived the crisis for a final briefing. 300 personnel had died in the initial excavation site. 4 Space Marines in the transit station engagement, 1 in the manufactorium battle, 3,000 workers fed to the Shard before containment, over 3,000 souls total, their consciousnesses erased from the universe, leaving no bodies to bury or mourn. The Emperor measures worth not by success, but by sacrifice, Mordrin said, his voice carrying across the assembled survivors. Today, 3,000 gave everything so that 3 million could live. Their names will be inscribed in the Chapel of Heroes aboard our strike cruiser. Their sacrifice will be remembered as long as our chapter endures. It was small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Talric accessed the containment facility's master control, performing final systems checks. Temporal stasis, holding at 87% efficiency. Blackstone suppression, active across all nodes. Void shields, overlapping envelopes at maximum strength. Geothermal power, stable and unlimited. Every indicator showed green. Every system functioned within acceptable parameters. The cage was complete. He activated the facility's designation protocols, inscribing its purpose into Mechanicus records that would endure for centuries. Containment Facility, Xerxes Prime. Contents, CTanShard. Designation, unknown. Threat level, apocalyptic. Authorization required for access, Fabricator General, or Astartes Chapter Master. The sun was setting over Arcturus Prime, or what passed for sunset, on a world where the sky was perpetual orange from industrial pollution. The toxic clouds caught the failing light, turned it amber and red and gold, painted the containment dome in colors that made it look almost beautiful. Almost. Theta 19 stood beside Talric, his arc pistol finally holstered, his duty complete. "We caged a god today, Magos. That's not something most people can claim." "We caged a fragment of a god," Talric corrected. "There are hundreds more buried across the galaxy, perhaps thousands, waiting to be found by excavation teams who don't know what they're digging toward." "Then we'd better hope they're as lucky as we were," the Skitarii replied. Lucky. Was that what they'd been? 3,000 dead, a forge world nearly consumed, a containment facility that might fail tomorrow or in 1,000 years. If this was luck, Talric wondered what misfortune looked like. But they'd survived. Against impossible odds, against a threat that predated humanity by millions of years, they'd survived. And survival in the 41st millennium was its own form of victory. He looked toward the containment dome one final time, toward the prison that would stand for centuries as a monument to human stubbornness and Mechanicus ingenuity. Inside, the CTanShard remained frozen, locked in the moment before its attack, its crystalline form caught mid-strike, waiting, patient, eternal. And in the depths of its impossible consciousness, slowed to a crawl by temporal stasis, it was already planning its escape. 3 weeks after the containment of the CTanShard, Arcturus Prime had returned to something resembling normalcy. The manufactoriums churned out ammunition and equipment at 80% of pre-crisis capacity. Hab blocks that had been evacuated were repopulated. The PDF garrison drilled with renewed intensity. Soldiers who'd faced cosmic horror now approaching their duties with the grim seriousness of people who understood what truly lurked in the galaxy's darkest corners. But some things would never return to normal. Containment facility Xerxes Prime stood in the heart of the industrial district, a 40-meter dome of adamantium and warnings that drew the eye like a scar on flesh. Pilgrims came daily, workers who'd lost family in the crisis, tech priests seeking to understand what lurked inside, even occasional imperial citizens who treated the facility like a shrine to humanity's defiance of cosmic forces. Talric-7 visited every morning, not because protocol demanded it, though it did, but because something deeper compelled him. He would stand at the facility's observation post, his optical sensors reviewing the telemetry data, confirming for the 1700th time that all systems remained within acceptable parameters. Temporal stasis holding at 83% efficiency. A 4% degradation from initial containment, but within predicted parameters. The field would last decades before requiring regeneration. Blackstone suppression, active across all nodes. Minor fluctuations detected every 7.3 hours, corresponding to what Vrolix theorized were the Shard's attempts to probe the containment matrix. Each probe was automatically rebuffed by the overlapping suppression fields.
Void shields, maintaining overlapping defensive envelopes at 91% strength. Power draw had decreased slightly as the shields adapted to the shard's quantum signature, learning to anticipate its reality manipulation attempts before they occurred. Everything was fine. Everything was contained. So why did Talric's organic components insist something was wrong? Librarian Zareth had similar concerns. The Space Marine visited the facility weekly, his psychic senses extended, probing for changes invisible to conventional sensors. His injuries had healed, gene seed and Astartes physiology repairing damage that would have killed unaugmented humans. But he moved with a new wariness, a hypervigilance that suggested the encounter had marked him in ways beyond the physical. "It's dreaming," Zareth said during one visit, his voice quiet with unease. "Its consciousness is slowed, but not stopped, and in that stretched time, it's thinking, processing, learning from its defeat." "Can it escape?" Talric asked the question that haunted his sleep cycles. "Not immediately. Perhaps not for centuries, but CTan are patient in ways mortals cannot comprehend. They've existed for millions of years. They can afford to think very, very slowly about very, very long-term plans." It wasn't reassuring. Serena Valdris had requested a transfer off Arcturus Prime. Talric approved it without hesitation. The young woman had earned her escape from this world of toxic skies and imprisoned gods. Her sister Maris had traveled from Hive Tertius to escort her to the transport ships, and they embraced with the desperate intensity of people who'd come too close to permanent separation. "Thank you," Serena said to Talric before boarding, for keeping your promise, for making sure I got to see her again. "Thank the Emperor, and the Omnisia, and the stubbornness of humanity that refuses to die when gods demand it." She smiled, a genuine expression that her face had seemed incapable of producing in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. "I'll remember this world, Magos, not just the horror, but what we did with the horror, how we turned it into something we could live with." That was humanity's true strength, Talric reflected as her transport lifted into the toxic sky. Not the ability to kill gods, but the ability to adapt to their existence. To build cages and monitoring stations and doctoral theses around cosmic threats. To treat apocalypse as just another engineering problem requiring innovative solutions. The brazen Minotaurs maintained their vigil. One squad rotated through the facility every 6 months, warriors who'd proven their capability against the CTan, taking turns ensuring it remained contained. They treated the duty with ritualistic seriousness, conducting hourly patrols, maintaining combat readiness as if the Shard might break free at any moment. Perhaps it would. Perhaps all their preparations would prove futile and the containment would fail catastrophically, releasing something even stronger than what they'd initially fought. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, the cage held. Tech Adept Vralix had been promoted, her actions during the crisis earning her recognition from the Fabricator General himself. She now led the permanent research team assigned to Facility Xerxes Prime, coordinating with Mechanicus adepts across 17 Forge worlds to share data about CTan physiology, containment methodologies, and theoretical weapons that might prove effective against star gods. "We're developing something," she told Talric during one of their regular consultations, her voice carrying carefully controlled excitement.
Based on what we learned from the Blackstone suppression fields, a weapon that doesn't destroy CTan, it anchors them, locks their quantum state so firmly that they can't edit reality outside containment. Preliminary testing shows, well, let's just say the next excavation team that accidentally awakes a god-fragment might have better options than run and pray. Progress. Slow, incremental, built on the bodies of 3,000 souls who'd paid the price for humanity's curiosity. But progress nonetheless. Theta 119 had been awarded the Macarian Cross for his actions during the evacuation, one of the highest honors the Skitarii could receive. He wore it with the same stoic indifference he showed everything else, a warrior for whom duty was its own reward, and medals were just additional weight on his combat harness. "Will you stay on Arcturus Prime?" Talric asked during one of their regular range sessions. Both found that shooting practice helped process the psychological aftermath of facing cosmic horror. "Where else would I go?" Theta 119 replied, his arc rifle punching holes through drones with mechanical precision. "The facility needs security. I know the terrain. I've faced the threat. Logic dictates I remain." He paused, cycled another target. "Besides, I want to be here when it escapes. Want to be the one who puts another round down range, knowing it won't work, but doing it anyway, because that's what humans do." Talric understood that sentiment perfectly. Captain Mordrin returned to orbit after establishing garrison protocols, but he left standing orders. If containment failed, the brazen Minotaurs would respond within 6 hours, regardless of where the chapter was deployed. The CTanShard had killed his brothers. He wouldn't allow it to escape unpunished.
"This isn't over," he told Talric before departing. "You've bought time, decades, perhaps centuries. But Star Guards are eternal, and eternal threats require eternal vigilance. The Imperium will be watching this facility until the end of time, or until we figure out how to properly kill what's inside," Talric replied. "If you discover that knowledge, Magos, share it widely. There are other shards out there, other prison tombs waiting to be breached by curious fools. What you've learned here might save billions of lives across the galaxy." It was a heavy responsibility, but the Mechanicus had never shied from heavy responsibilities. In the months following containment, Talric's excavation protocols were updated across 17 sectors. New regulations required extensive auspex scanning before any dig exceeded certain depths. Warning signs for Necron architecture were distributed to every Mechanicus expedition. Emergency containment equipment, Blackstone fragments, temporal stasis generators, void shield projectors became standard issue for archaeotech recovery teams. The lessons of Arcturus Prime were being learned, slowly, institutionally. In the grinding bureaucratic way the Imperium processed information across its million worlds. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was something. Talric stood at his observation post, watching the sunrise paint the containment dome in amber and gold. Inside, frozen in temporal stasis, slowed to near imperceptibility, the CTanShard waited, with patience that made mountains seem hasty.
It had fed on 3,000 souls, learned to manipulate magnetic rails and thermal energy, adapted to plasma fire and kinetic rounds, fought space marines to a standstill, and nearly escaped containment through sheer will. And now it was imprisoned, studying its cage with consciousness stretched across subjective centuries, thinking thoughts that moved slower than continental drift, but never, ever stopped. One day, decades or centuries or millennia from now, it would escape. Talric knew this with certainty that transcended mere calculation. All cages failed eventually. All prisons found their limits. All walls came down when given enough time and sufficient pressure. But until that day, humanity would stand watch, would maintain the seals and monitor the readings, and train the next generation of guards who would inherit this eternal vigil. Because that was what humanity did. When confronted with gods and horrors and threats that should have ended the species, they built walls and called it victory. They turned apocalypse into architecture and moved on with the grim determination of a species too stubborn to accept extinction. Talric's vox grill crackled with the morning briefing. All systems nominal, no anomalies detected, containment holding at acceptable parameters. Another day survived. Another day the universe didn't end. In the 41st millennium, that qualified as a triumph. He turned from the observation post and began his rounds. 17 monitoring stations to visit, 43 tech priests to supervise, endless calculations to review. The work of maintaining civilization one equation at a time, of holding back the darkness with mathematics and faith. Behind him, inside its prison of adamantium and time, the CTanShard dreamed its slow dreams of stars and hunger. And in the toxic sky above Arcturus Prime, the Emperor's servants continued their eternal watch, knowing that vigilance was the price of survival, and survival was the only victory that mattered. The cage held. For now. The story of containment facilities Xerxes Prime became legend across the Mechanicus. Tech priests studied the crisis in their monastery forges, analyzing every decision, every calculation, every desperate improvisation that had transformed catastrophe into containment. The incident report alone ran 17,000 pages. Every sensor reading, every casualty, every prayer offered during those terrible hours when humanity caged a fragment of a star god. 3,000 souls were commemorated, their names inscribed in the facility's foundation, carved into adamantium plates that would endure for millennia. Menials and tech priests, PDF soldiers and space marines, all equal in death, all worthy of remembrance. The ecclesiarchy declared them martyrs, souls who'd given everything so that millions could live. It was inadequate tribute, but tribute nonetheless. Magos Dominus Talric-7 lived another 73 years after the containment. He never left Arcturus Prime, dedicating the remainder of his existence to maintaining the facility, to refining its systems, to ensuring that the cage held. When his organic components finally failed and his consciousness faded from the machine network, his body was interred in the facility's memorial chamber, a final guardian watching over the prisoner he'd helped capture. Serena Valdris wrote a memoir that was published across 17 sectors. I survived the awakening, became required reading in Schola Progenium academies, a first-hand account of cosmic horror and human resilience that taught generations of future officers what to do when confronting threats beyond comprehension. She lived to 87 standard years, long enough to see her grandchildren join the Imperial Guard, carrying forward the legacy of survival. Theta 19 remained at his post for 41 years until enemy fire finally claimed him during an unrelated Xenos incursion. He died as he'd lived, standing between humanity and extinction, his arc rifle hot, his duty fulfilled. His body was buried beside Talric's, two warriors from different traditions united in their commitment to eternal vigilance. The brazen Minotaurs kept their word. For centuries, one squad maintained watch over facility Xerxes Prime. When the chapter was called to distant campaigns, they left behind equipment and authority codes, ensuring their brothers could return at a moment's notice if the cage began to fail. And the CTanShard? It remained imprisoned, locked in temporal stasis that would last approximately 417 years before requiring renewal. Inside its frozen consciousness, it continued its slow contemplation, thinking thoughts that spanned subjective millennia, planning escape scenarios that wouldn't mature for epochs. But humanity was patient too, and stubborn, and absolutely unwilling to surrender even to gods. Containment Facility Xerxes Prime stands today, a monument to the moment when mortals looked at a star god and said no. When desperate humans armed with ancient stones and desperate courage built a cage that held. When the Imperium proved once again that humanity's greatest strength wasn't firepower or faith, it was the stubborn refusal to die when the universe demanded it. The warning klaxons have never sounded, the containment has never failed, and every morning tech priests conduct their rounds, checking sensors and offering prayers, maintaining the eternal vigil that separates civilization from catastrophe. Because in the 41st millennium, there are worse things than death lurking in the darkness between stars. There are gods that hunger. There are horrors that predate reality itself. There are threats so terrible that simply surviving their attention qualifies as victory. And humanity survives, day by day, prayer by prayer, one stubborn act of defiance at a time. The CTanShard remains caged in Facility Xerxes Prime, dreaming its slow dreams of stars and freedom. And around it, humanity stands watch, knowing that the cage must hold, not forever perhaps, but for today. And in the grim darkness of the far future, today is all anyone can promise. The Emperor protects, the Omnicia provides, and the vigilant never sleep. The cage holds.